They called it an immersive social dynamics game. I call it a cage. Welcome to Wildwood Executive Retreat, a place where the price of leadership is far higher than the corporate expense account. My name is Rowan Mercer, a former ethics student seeking refuge, but I found myself forced into a real-life game of werewolf, bound by 3 strange rules just to survive the night. What's the creepiest game you've ever been forced to play? Tell me in the comments below. And if you're brave enough to join the retreat, subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules and ring that bell. Because in this game, the monsters aren't always hidden. The assessment begins. True monsters, I've come to believe, aren't the stuff of gothic novels or late-night creature features. They're cultivated quietly in the fertile soil of human desperation, watered by eroded ethics and the silent surrender of will. I should know the academic scandal at Blackwood University, the one that had my name plastered across ethics review boards, and subsequently incinerated my doctoral ambitions in moral philosophy, hadn't been my doing. I was a scapegoat, a convenient sacrifice on the altar of institutional reputation. But the fallout had left me adrift, disillusioned, questioning the very foundations of the principles I'd once so fervently championed. That's how I found myself stepping off a charter bus into the unnerving, profound silence of the Wildwood Executive Retreat. A sprawling, rustic lodge nestled deep within a forgotten valley of the Colorado Rockies. 12 of us, a carefully selected diverse group of professionals, had been lured here by a handsome stipend and the promise of participating in a cutting-edge, immersive social dynamics game designed to test leadership and team-building skills under pressure, or so the glossy brochure had claimed. The lodge itself was a masterpiece of rugged, isolated charm. Massive timber beams, roaring stone fireplaces, panoramic windows, overlooking a vast, ancient forest that seemed to press in on all sides, swallowing sound, light, and perhaps sanity. The air was crisp, smelling of pine, damp earth, and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettlingly feral, like a freshly killed animal hidden just out of sight. On my first morning, after a night of thin, uneasy sleep, punctuated by the distant, mournfully close howl of what I desperately tried to convince myself was just a coyote, I found it, a small, plain white card, typed with an old-fashioned, slightly uneven ribbon, resting on my antique bedside table. There was no greeting, no explanation, just one sentence. Rule 1. Count the players every morning. If there's one extra, and there often is, don't ask who they are or where they came from. Simply acknowledge their presence and continue as normal. Breakfast was a tense, strangely formal affair in the grand vaulted dining hall. 12 of us, as per the official participant list. I counted twice. Then a 13th person materialized at the long oak table, settling into a previously empty chair as if they'd been there all along. Nondescript, quiet. Male? Female? I couldn't quite tell. They ate little, spoke nothing, and no one else seemed to register their sudden appearance. I remembered the rule, a cold knot tightening in my stomach, and forced myself to look away, to engage in the stilted introductory pleasantries. By the time coffee was served, the 13th chair was empty again, the plate untouched. No one mentioned them. Our game master, a disembodied, unnervingly calm, and gender-neutral voice that emanated from hidden speakers throughout the lodge, laid out the basic structure after that unsettling first meal. Daily challenges, designed to test our problem-solving and collaborative skills. Nightly elimination rounds, where one participant, deemed by group consensus during a daytime assessment phase to be detrimental to team cohesion, would be removed. The ultimate goal, to be the last team member standing. It sounded like a corporate psychology experiment gone slightly Lord of the Flies. The game master's voice, smooth and devoid of any discernible emotion, then delivered the second rule. its chilling detachment sending a fresh wave of unease through the already tense room. Never vote to eliminate anyone during the day. Phase assessment, unless you are absolutely, unequivocally certain of their detrimental impact. The pack always remembers who speaks out against them, especially when they speak in error or with malice. Zuch. Misjudgments often have unforeseen consequences. I met Eden Rowe during the first icebreaker exercise, a pointless, awkward scavenger hunt in the immediate vicinity of the lodge. She was striking, with an intelligent, watchful stillness about her, her eyes a cool, analytical gray. She moved with a quiet confidence, rarely speaking unless spoken to, her observations always sharp, incisive. She seemed, apart from the forced bonhomie and rising anxiety of the others. Later that day, the Game Master's voice announced the first night phase elimination. Mark Jessup, a loud, abrasive sales executive who had spent most of the previous day loudly complaining about the quality of the instant coffee and the remoteness of the location, was simply gone. No dramatic announcement, no explanation. His room, when a few of the braver participants dared to check, was empty, his suitcase still packed, his bed neatly made, as if he'd never been there at all. The Game Master, when questioned via the intercom system, merely stated, participant Jessup's contribution to the team dynamic was assessed as complete. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, filled with unspoken fears. The game had begun, and it already felt less like a test of team building, and more like something else entirely. The disappearance of Mark Jessup, as clinical and uncommented upon as a software update, sent a ripple of genuine fear through our curated little collective. The carefully constructed facade of a social dynamics game was already beginning to crack, revealing something uglier, more primal, beneath. Paranoia, that insidious little microbe, began to spread. Sideways glances, hushed whispers in shadowed corners. The forced smiles became brittle, the laughter strained. Theo Briggs, a beefy, aggressive man who'd introduced himself as a risk management consultant, a euphemism I suspected, for something far less savory, became the self-appointed inquisitor. He was loud, accusatory, his fear manifesting as a belligerent need to find a scapegoat, a target for the group's burgeoning anxiety. Someone's messing with us, he'd bellowed during our second morning's awkward breakfast, where, once again, a silent, unnoticed 13th individual had briefly occupied a chair before vanishing like smoke. This isn't a game. Jessup didn't just leave. One of us is a plant, a saboteur. His gaze swept the room, lingering on the quieter members, the ones who didn't meet his challenging stare. Rowan Mercer, I noted with a fresh wave of unease, remained silent throughout Briggs' tirade, his eyes downcast, observing us all from beneath lowered lids. Eden Rowe, too, was an island of unnerving calm, her expression thoughtful, almost analytical, as if she were observing a particularly interesting petri dish of human behavior. Rule number 2, never vote during the day. Face unless you are absolutely certain. The pack remembers, pulsed in my mind like a dull, throbbing headache. Lair Crown, a mousy, meticulous young woman who introduced herself as a freelance data analyst, and who always seemed to be scribbling furiously in a small, leather-bound notebook, became increasingly agitated by the extra player phenomenon. It's not random, Rowan, she'd whispered to me later that day, her eyes wide, her notes filled with complex tallies and observations. The count. When they're here, the total number of people at the table, it's always a prime number. 13 this morning, 11 yesterday after Jessup left. It's a sequence. It means something. She was trying to impose logic on the illogical, a pursuit I understood all too well. Theo Briggs, however, was having none of it. Fueled by the Game Master's continued, chilling silence regarding Jessup's fate, he forced the issue. He demanded a daytime assessment vote. We need to flush out the weak link. He roared, the one who's not a team player, the one who's working against us. His accusations, wild and unfocused at first, eventually settled on Sarah Bell, a quiet, nervous graphic designer who had the misfortune of bursting into tears under the pressure of his interrogation. Despite the Game Master's earlier warning, despite Rule 2, the group, desperate for a target, for a semblance of control, succumbed. Sarah was voted out, her protests, her terrified sobs, ignored. The Game Master's voice, when it finally came over the intercom later that afternoon, was as smooth and devoid of emotion as ever. Participant Bell's role in this dynamic has concluded. The assessment phase is now complete for today. That night, the howls from the surrounding forests were closer, more numerous, and possessed a distinctly, terrifyingly predatory edge. And then, a new, even more disturbing development began. The food, the meticulously prepared, if somewhat bland, meals provided by the lodge's unseen kitchen staff suddenly started to taste wrong. Not spoiled, but unappetizing. Flat, like cardboard. I noticed others pushing their food around their plates, their appetites inexplicably gone. And then, the dreams started. Vivid, disturbing dreams. Not just for me, but, as hushed, fearful morning conversations revealed, for several others as well. Dreams of running through the moonlit forest, the scent of pine and blood thick in the air. Dreams of an exhilarating, almost unbearable hunger. Dreams of tearing into raw, warm flesh. Rule number 3, the one I hadn't yet found on any typewritten card, the one the Game Master hadn't yet deigned to reveal, was beginning to make its insidious presence known. When you start craving raw meat, the hunger chose you. The next morning, Leah Crown was gone. Her chair at the breakfast table was empty. Her meticulously kept notebook, however, lay open beside her untouched plate. The last entry scrawled in a shaky, almost illegible hand. The count is wrong again. 10. Not prime. Something is missing. Or something new has been added. He needs a full table to choose from. The hunger, it's not a symptom, it's an invitation. Leah Crown's vacant chair, her chilling final entry, cast a pall of genuine, undeniable terror over the remaining participants. 10 of us now. The game, if it had ever been just a game, had shed its pretense. This was about survival, and something was methodically, patiently winnowing our numbers. Theo Briggs, his face a mottled purple of fear and impotent rage after Leah's disappearance, became even more unbearable. Why, his accusations grew wilder, his demands for action more frantic. He now targeted Victor Hale, the 50-something corporate executive who had initially, and somewhat reluctantly, taken on the role of our de facto team leader. You were supposed to keep us safe, Hale, Briggs bellowed across the breakfast table, his voice cracking. You're in charge. What the hell is going on here? Who are you protecting, Hala? A man whose urbane confidence had been steadily eroding with each fresh horror could only stare back, his eyes hollow, his hand visibly trembling as he tried to lift his coffee cup. My own senses were undergoing a disturbing transformation. The world seemed sharper, more intensely defined, and the smells. I could smell the fear coiling off Briggs like a rank animal musk. I could smell the stale coffee on Hale's breath from across the room. And then, during one of the Game Master's pointless team-building exercises, constructing a rudimentary shelter in the woods using only materials we could scavenge, I smelled it. Blood. bright, coppery, alluring. Amelia Chen, a quiet architect, had scraped her hand on a piece of rough bark. It was a minor cut, barely a scratch, but the scent of those few crimson drops, welling on her skin from 20 feet away, hit me with the force of a physical blow, making my mouth water, making my stomach clench with a sudden, shocking, and utterly alien hunger. I found myself staring at the pulse beating softly in her throat, a predatory focus narrowing my vision, an urge so primal, so wrong it terrified me. I looked at Eden Rowe. She was watching me, her cool gray eyes missing nothing. There was no surprise in her gaze, no judgment, only a detached, almost clinical interest, as if she had been expecting this, as if she knew. The Game Master's disembodied voice announced another night phase elimination with its usual chilling neutrality. This time, Theo Briggs, after his public, vicious, and ultimately baseless accusation against a terrified young intern named David Kim during a particularly fraught afternoon assessment session, a clear, desperate violation of rule number 2. His fate had been sealed. His fate had been sealed. David Kim was still with us, shaken but alive. Theo Briggs was simply gone. His room, when a few of us dared to check, was undisturbed, save for the faint, lingering scent of his fear, and something else. That same, faint, metallic, feral odor I'd noticed in the woods. It was Eden who found his backpack, tucked away behind a loose stone in the massive fireplace in the main lodge. She presented it to the group with that same unnerving calm. Perhaps Mr. Briggs left us a souvenir, she'd murmured, her voice soft, almost indifferent. Inside, amidst his spare clothes and a dog-eared copy of The Art of War, was a small oilskin pouch. It was heavy. With trembling hands, Rowan Mercer. I opened it. My stomach heaved. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a clue. It was a collection of small, disturbingly gnawed bones. Animal bones, mostly. Squirrels, rabbits. But nestled amongst them, unmistakably, horrifyingly, was a single, delicate human finger bone, picked clean, with what looked like human teeth marks. Theo Briggs hadn't just been eliminated. He had been consumed. Or he had become a consumer. The discovery of the gnawed bones in Theo Briggs' backpack shattered the last vestiges of denial for most of the remaining group. We were not participants in a social experiment. We were cattle in a very exclusive, very specialized abattoir. Victor Hale, our nominal leader, disintegrated before our eyes. His attempts at maintaining order, at projecting an aura of corporate competence, crumbled. He started muttering to himself, his eyes darting, his hands constantly fidgeting. He complained of an unquenchable thirst that no amount of water could satisfy, and an equally unbearable hunger that the lodge now almost universally rejected food could not touch. He swore he heard scratching sounds at his locked bedroom door at night, the rasp of claws on wood. My own cravings were becoming an agony. The scent of blood, once a distant intellectual concept in my ethics studies, was now a constant, maddening siren song. I found myself staring at the other survivors, not as colleagues, not as fellow victims, but as potential sustenance. The pulse beating in Amelia Chen's throat, the soft curve of David Kim's forearm, the way old Mr. Abernathy, a retired librarian, wheezed with each breath, his flesh seeming soft, yielding. These thoughts, these predatory assessments, were horrifyingly, undeniably my own. I fought them, recoiling in self-disgust, but the hunger, deep and primal, was a relentless, gnawing counterpoint to my fraying reason. The Game Master, if it even was a single entity, knew. Rule 3 was tightening its grip. The hunger chose you. Eden Rowe, throughout all this, remained an enigma of calm observation. She watched my internal struggle, her cool gray eyes holding a flicker of something I couldn't decipher. Pity? Contempt? Or perhaps a kind of detached academic fascination. One evening, as I sat alone by the cold fireplace, trying to read, trying to ignore the gnawing emptiness in my stomach, she approached me, moving with her usual silent grace. Hunger can be a powerful clarifier, wouldn't you agree, Rowan? She'd murmured, her voice soft, almost hypnotic. It strips away the extraneous, reduces things to their essential truths. She paused, her gaze intense. What is your essential truth, Rowan? When the veneer of civilization is gnawed away. The game master's voice that evening announced a new challenge. Not a team-building exercise, not a puzzle. A Zustanos acquisition protocol. It had intoned, its voice chillingly devoid of inflection. Participants will proceed individually into the designated forest perimeter. Resources are available for those with the will to procure them. Failure to acquire adequate sustenance will result in metabolic reassessment. It was a test, a hunt. And we were, I suspected, both the hunters and the hunted. The forest was a place of deepening shadows and unnerving watchful silences. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, pine, and that underlying feral tang, stronger now, more acrid urine. I was alone, armed only with a cheap compass and a growing, terrible certainty. The hunger was a living thing within me, clawing, demanding. I stumbled through the undergrowth, my senses preternaturally sharp. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves amplified. And then I saw Victor Hale. He was crouched over something small and furry. A rabbit, perhaps, his movements jerky, animalistic. He wasn't using a knife. He was tearing at it with his teeth, his face contorted in a mask of primal, desperate need, snarling, guttural sounds ripping from his throat. He looked up as I approached, his eyes no longer human, but wild, bloodshot pupils dilated to black pools. He lunged, not at me, but at David Kim, the young intern, who had stumbled out of the trees, pale and terrified. "Food!" Hale shrieked, his voice a raw, broken travesty of human speech. He clawed at David, trying to bite his arm, his neck. David screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror. Before Halo could do irreparable damage, before any of us could react further, something moved in the shadows, too fast to see. A blur of darkness and impossible speed. There was a sickening, wet tearing sound, and Victor Hale was simply gone, dragged into the undergrowth with a final, choked scream. His last comprehensible words, gurgled out between sobs and feral snarls, echoed in the sudden, horrified silence. Didn't want to. The hunger, it chose me. I just wanted to be safe. The forest floor where he had stood was dark with warm, fresh, glistening blood. Krasaroth, or its harbinger, had claimed its first clear, undeniable victim of Rule 3, and the hunger within me, a cold, hollow echo of Hale's own, intensified, a screaming void, demanding to be filled. Victor Hale's horrific end, his desperate half-human cries swallowed by the indifferent forest, was a brutal, visceral confirmation. The hunger wasn't just a symptom of the game. It was the game. Kratzarot, the devourer in flesh, wasn't just a legend whispered by a frightened cook. It was real, and it was a patient, discerning connoisseur of human desperation, slowly, meticulously, priming its chosen vessel. And I, Rowan Mercer, former ethics student, current unwilling participant in this abattoir of the soul, was undeniably, terrifyingly on its menu. Or perhaps I was meant to be the one setting the table. The days that followed were a descent into a waking nightmare, a landscape of heightened senses and eroding self-control. The world became a symphony of tormenting aromas. The coppery tang of spilled blood from Amelia Chen's now infected scratch. The subtle, warm, living scent of David Kim's fear sweat. The gamey, almost irresistible allure of old Mr. Abernathy's fragile, bird-like pulse beating just beneath his thin, papery skin. My own reflection in the large, dusty windows became that of a stranger. Eyes too bright, unnervingly focused, pupils dilated even in the dim light, a gaunt, predatory tension tightening the skin over my cheekbones. The lodged food was now utterly repellent, ashes and dust in my mouth. Only the thought of raw, warm, yielding flesh could stir even a semblance of appetite. An appetite that now felt less like a need and more like a sacred, irresistible calling. It was Eden Rowe who found me during one of these fugue states. Crouched in the abandoned pantry, my fingers raw from trying to claw open a tin of what I'd irrationally hoped might be raw, preserved meat. She didn't express alarm or pity. She simply watched me, her cool gray eyes holding that familiar, unnerving mixture of detached clinical interest and something else. Something that might have been approval. "You feel it, don't you, Rowan?" she murmured, her voice soft, almost a caress, yet chillingly devoid of genuine warmth. The clarity, the sharpening of perspective, the hunger. "It's not a curse, you know. It's a purification." She knelt beside me, her presence not threatening, but unnervingly intimate. Krazaroth doesn't invade, Rowan. It doesn't possess. It reveals. It strips away the tiresome, self-imposed restraints of your so-called morality, the fragile constructs of your civilized self. It shows you what you truly are, what you truly need. Her words, insane as they were, resonated with a horrifying, seductive logic within the screaming void of my own unnatural cravings. My carefully constructed ethical framework, already battered by the academic scandal that had derailed my life, felt like a rotten, crumbling edifice against the tsunami of this primal, all-consuming need. What are you?" I managed to rasp, my throat dry, my gaze fixed on the pulse beating softly in her own exposed neck. Eden smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible curve of her lips. "I am an observer, Rowan. Student of thresholds. I believe that entities like Krazaroth, the primal forces you might call demonic, are not summoned by arcane incantations or dusty grimoires. They are invited, cultivated. They manifest when the conditions are right. When a closed system like our little retreat here reaches a certain critical point of psychological pressure, when trust erodes, when fear becomes the dominant currency, when the social contract shatters." She gestured vaguely around the decaying lodge. "This isn't just a game, Rowan. It's an incubator, a crucible." Her words, her calm, almost academic detachment, were more terrifying than any overt threat. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't even just a survivor. She was something else, a facilitator, a weaver of this intricate web of despair. You orchestrated this?" I whispered, the full horror of her role dawning. "The rules, the eliminations, the hunger?" "The rules," Eden said, her voice still a soft, reasonable murmur, "are merely parameters, psychological stressors, designed to identify the most receptive candidate. The eliminations, unfortunate perhaps, but necessary to heighten the ambient emotional charge. The hunger." Her eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim pantry light. "The hunger is Krazaroth's gentle knock, Rowan. its invitation to the feast. It chooses the one whose own suppressed desires, whose own latent capacity for transgression resonates most strongly with its own. I remembered then something I found earlier that day, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Eden's meticulously neat, almost sterile room. Not a journal filled with fears and anxieties like Leah's, but a series of cold, precise, almost anthropological notes. Psychological profiles of each participant, including myself, detailing our perceived weaknesses, our past traumas, our potential breaking points, and alongside these, hand-drawn schematics of the lodge and the surrounding woods, not escape routes, but flowcharts, diagrams illustrating how to manipulate group dynamics, how to channel fear, how to isolate individuals, how to optimize the environment for what? For Krazarov's emergence. She hadn't been playing the game. She'd been designing it, calibrating it. You're not its servant, I realized with a fresh wave of revulsion. You're its damn recruitment officer. Eden's smile widened, a chilling, almost predatory baring of teeth. Perhaps I am merely a pragmatist Rowan, a believer in potential. Krazaroth offers a unique form of symbiosis, an evolution. You would still be you. Just more. Stronger. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to an intimate conspiratorial whisper. The others, they are weak, terrified. Their fear is unrefined. But you, Rowan, your struggle, your ethical torment, it makes your potential surrender all the more exquisite. Krazaroth has a discerning palate. She gestured towards the pantry door. Outside, I could hear the panicked, whimpering sobs of David Kim, the young intern, the only other participant, besides myself and Eden, who was, as far as I knew, still alive. The others, Abernathy, Amelia Chen. They had vanished in the preceding days, their disappearances marked only by the Game Master's emotionless announcements of metabolic reassessment. He is terrified, Rowan, Eden murmured, her eyes fixed on mine, holding a chilling invitation. His fear is ripe, a first offering, perhaps, to seal the bond, to embrace your true nature. The choice was there. Stark and terrible, David Kim trembling and broken, a mere arm's length away. And within me, Krazarov's hunger, a screaming, insatiable void, urging me to yield, to feast, to become. The game wasn't about identifying a monster among us. It was about the meticulous, patient, and utterly depraved cultivation of a monster within one of us. And Eden Rowe, the quiet observer, the weaver of this infernal design, was calmly, rationally, offering me the butcher's apron. The pantry, with its lingering scent of spoiled hope and the faint, coppery tang of old blood, felt like the antechamber to hell itself. David Kim's terrified sobs from beyond the door were a visceral counterpoint to Eden Rowe's calm, persuasive whispers and the gnawing, insatiable inferno of Krazaroth's hunger raging within me. My sharpened senses picked up every nuance of his fear, the frantic lubdub of his heart, the salty tang of his sweat, the warm, irresistible pulse of life. Just beneath his fragile skin, the monster I was becoming, the one Eden had so meticulously cultivated, urged me to tear down the door, to silence his pathetic whimpering with a single, satisfying crimson act. But then, through the red haze of that primal urge, another voice, fainter but more persistent, echoed. My own, the Rowan Mercer who had once believed in moral philosophy, in the inherent worth of a human soul, in the possibility of redemption, even after the bitter sting of betrayal, that Rowan was horrified, sickened by the predatory thoughts now consuming him. No, I managed to rasp the single word, a monumental effort against the tide of hunger. My hands, which had unconsciously clenched into claws, slowly, painfully relaxed. Eden's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. A flicker of disappointment, or perhaps just recalibrated academic interest, crossed her cool gray eyes. "No, Rowan," she murmured, her voice still a silken caress. A rather anachronistic response under the circumstances. The hunger. It doesn't appreciate denial for long. It will have its due, one way or another. This isn't me," I said, more to convince myself than her. I looked at my own hands, at the way they trembled, at the strange predatory alertness in my own reflected gaze from a polished can on the shelf. "This craving, it's a violation, is it?" Eden challenged softly. "Or is it merely the stripping away of artifice, the revealing of the essential, unadorned self? You speak of violation, Rowan, but what about the violation of your own potential? The denial of your own strength? Krazaroth offers power, clarity, an end to the tiresome, endless dithering of the human conscience." I remembered then with a sudden shocking clarity one of the game master's early pronouncements, one of the rules I hadn't found written down, but had been delivered by that disembodied voice. Never vote during the day phase assessment unless you are absolutely, unequivocally certain. The pack always remembers who speaks out against them. Words, votes, accusations. They were the currency of this game. The tools Eden had used to dismantle our fragile social contract. To isolate, to terrify, to prime the chosen host. Speech itself had become a weapon, a trigger for elimination, a pathway to damnation. If words could condemn, then perhaps silence could be a shield. A different kind of defiance, with a surge of desperate, agonizing resolve. I did the only thing I could think of that might break the pattern, that might render me unpalatable, a non-participant in Eden's grotesque social experiment, a failed vessel for Krazaroth's hunger. My eyes fell upon a jagged shard of broken ceramic on the pantry floor, from a dropped plate earlier in the week. My hand, shaking violently, reached for it. Eden watched, her expression unreadable, as I brought the sharp, dirty edge to my own tongue. The pain was searing, an explosion of white-hot agony that momentarily eclipsed even the gnawing hunger. Blood, warm and coppery, filled my mouth, a grotesque parody of the sustenance Krazaroth craved. I bit down hard, not on flesh, but on my own capacity for speech, for accusation, for the verbal participation that this infernal game demanded. I collapsed against the pantry shelves, gasping, the taste of my own blood a bitter, metallic sacrament. I couldn't speak. I couldn't vote. I couldn't accuse. I could only endure. Through the haze of pain, I saw Eden Rowe rise slowly. She looked down at me, her head tilted in that familiar, analytical way. There was no horror on her face, no pity. Only a kind of dispassionate, academic curiosity. Her experiment had yielded an unexpected, perhaps even intriguing, data point. The atypical outlier. "Fascinating, Rowan," she murmured, almost to herself. Self-abnegation as a survival strategy. An attempt to opt out of the dominant resource acquisition paradigm. Highly inefficient from a purely biological standpoint. But the psychological implications. She made a small, precise note in a tiny, leather-bound notebook she produced from a pocket. Krazaroth will be displeased It prefers its vessels, articulate in their submission. She gave me one last, lingering look, then turned and walked out of the pantry, her footsteps silent on the creaking floorboards. She didn't try to help me. She didn't try to stop me. She simply observed and recorded. The hunger still gnawed, a dull, aching fire in my belly. But now, it was mingled with a new, sharper pain and a strange, almost liberating silence. I had refused the feast. I had silenced my own capacity to participate in the vote that brought monsters into existence. What that meant for my survival, or for Krasarov's thwarted appetite, I didn't know. I only knew that in that moment of desperate self-mutilation, I had perhaps reclaimed a tiny bloody shard of the Rowan Mercer I thought had been lost forever. The days, or perhaps weeks, that followed my desperate act in the pantry are a blur of pain, fever, and a silence broken only by the distant, terrified screams of David Kim and the unnervingly calm, periodic announcements from the game masters. These embodied voice, detailing further metabolic reassessments. I lay there, drifting in and out of a bloody, pain-laced consciousness. The hunger, a dull, constant ache, my self-inflicted wound throbbing, agonizing testament to my refusal. I don't know what happened to David. I don't know what happened to the lodge. My world had shrunk to the four walls of that dusty, blood-stained pantry and the insistent, gnawing emptiness within me. Then, rescue, or at least a version of it. Park rangers, their faces grim and uncomprehending, responding to some long overdue distress signal, or perhaps just a routine check on the isolated property. I was the only one they found alive, emaciated, mute, running a raging fever, but alive. Of Eden Row, of the other participants of the Game Master, there was no sign. Only a derelict, silent lodge, its rooms empty, its tables still set for a meal that would never be eaten. The air thick with the faint, lingering scent of pine, old fear, and something else, something metallic and inexplicably, eternally hungry. The official story was a masterpiece of bland obfuscation. A corporate retreat gone tragically wrong. Hypothermia, malnutrition, possible hallucinogenic contaminants in the local water supply. My inability to speak, my profound psychological trauma, was attributed to the horrors I had supposedly witnessed my colleagues inflict upon each other in a shared psychotic episode. I became a case study in extreme environmental stress, a footnote in some obscure psychological journal. Eden Row, of course, resurfaced unscathed. She was found weeks later, miles from the lodge, claiming to have escaped the group's descent into madness. Her calm, articulate testimony a stark, believable contrast to my own shattered silence. She even expressed professional concern for my well-being. Years passed. The physical wounds healed, though a puckered, ugly scar remained on my tongue, a constant reminder. Speech returned, slowly, haltingly, but the words always felt inadequate, tainted. I lived a quiet, isolated life, haunted by the silence of the wildwood, by the memory of Eden's cool, analytical gaze, by the phantom pangs of a hunger that, though dormant, never truly left me. Then, one rain-swept autumn afternoon, while browsing a university bulletin board, a flyer caught my eye, a prestigious academic symposium. The keynote speaker, Eden Row, PhD. Her topic, the mechanisms of moral collapse and emergent primal hierarchies in closed survival systems, a case study analysis. I attended. I had to. She stood at the podium, poised, articulate, a respected academic, addressing a rapt audience of her peers. Her presentation was brilliant, chillingly detached, filled with complex diagrams of group dynamics, psychological stress vectors, and a theoretical framework for the spontaneous emergence of apex predatory behavior in resource-scarce, ethically compromised environments. And then, her final slide. A complex flowchart illustrating the progression of her case study. XB712 anonymized subjects. Arrows indicating escalating paranoia, trust erosion, angustia eventual, inevitable triggering of primal survival instincts. And then at the very bottom of the slide, in small, almost invisible print, a chilling final footnote. Note: 12 subjects entered the isolation phase. Spontaneous hierarchical restructuring and resource acquisition strategies observed. 11 subjects achieved primal satiation through emergent interspecies predation and subsequent metabolic assimilation. 1 subject, designated adhere, exhibited a typical non-compliance, choosing self-abnegation over participation in the dominant resource acquisition paradigm. Further research indicated on the psychophysiological impact of atypical outliers in influencing pack cohesion and entity manifestation. Thresholds. Our eyes met across the crowded lecture hall. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Eden Rose's lips. Her experiment, I realized with a sudden, soul-freezing certainty, was far from over. I hadn't been a survivor. I had simply been data, an interesting anomaly in her ongoing, horrifying research into the precise academic methodology of voting monsters into existence. The hunger was still out there, and Eden was still meticulously setting the table. The real horror wasn't Krazaroth. It was the cold, rational human mind that so willingly, so patiently, invited it in. Wildwood holds its secrets and its hunger close. Rowan Mercer learned that some games don't end when the sun rises. The rules were a terrifying blueprint. But the true horror was always the one who designed the game. Krazaroth is real, and its appetite is boundless. Seriously, if you didn't stay until the very end, you missed the ultimate chilling revelation, the twist that changes everything you thought you knew about Wildwood. The final moments will leave you questioning who the real monster is. What do you think Krazaroth is? What was Eden Rose's true role? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you made it out of Wildwood, if the hunger hasn't claimed you, then you're already a part of our story. Subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules, because some retreats, they're not designed for relaxation. And the final assessment is always waiting. Some places don't just house secrets, they embody them. Welcome to St. Albine, a mysterious orphanage nestled deep in the Pennsylvania mountains, a place where innocence and dread walk hand in hand. My name is Elias Wren, and I came here seeking peace, a quiet place to hide from my past. Instead, I was given 3 strange rules just to stay alive. What's the creepiest thing you've ever seen in a children's drawing? Tell me in the comments below. Tell me in the comments below. And if you're brave enough to walk these corridors after dark, subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules and ring that bell, because at St. Albine, the art, it wants to be seen. Let's check under the bed. I still wake up, smelling antiseptic and old stone. The scent of St. Albine burned into my memory. I went there seeking peace after the whispers at the Sunnyside Rest Home became too loud, seeking solace in the presumed innocence of children. They gave me a small cottage on the grounds of that sprawling, Gothic orphanage, nestled deep in the Pennsylvania mountains, and 3 simple rules for my role as a caretaker. Carry a small crucifix when walking the old corridors. Always check under the beds before tucking the children in. Sometimes there's an extra child. And never, ever let them draw you in their pictures. Old Mr. Hemlock, the groundskeeper who hired me, a man whose eyes held a sorrow too deep for words, just shook his head when I asked why. He only muttered that the last caretaker who ignored the drawings wasn't just gone. He was erased. St. Albine orphanage rose from the mist-shrouded Pennsylvania hills like a forgotten headstone. Its gray stone walls streaked with ancient damp, its narrow windows staring out like vacant eyes. The wind, a constant, mournful presence here, sighed through the skeletal branches of overgrown oaks, carrying the faint, cloying scent of something sweetish and decaying beneath the pervasive sharpness of industrial cleaner. It was a place where silence seemed to have weight, pressing down, broken only by the distant, jarring laughter of unseen children, or the rhythmic creak of a weather vane shaped like a gaunt, pointing finger. My name is Elias Wren. My name is Elias Wren. I came to St. Albine looking for an ending, or perhaps a quiet intermission. The last chapter, at Sunnyside, had ended abruptly. My attempts to voice concerns about the irregularities, the way elderly patients seemed to simply dissolve from the records, met with polite disbelief and eventual dismissal. They'd called it stress, a morbid imagination. I called it an unease that settled deep in the marrow. Children, I'd thought, would be different. Their fears, their shadows, surely more transparent. The main hall was cavernous, its vaulted ceiling lost in gloom, the walls lined with an unnerving profusion of children's artwork, bright chaotic splashes of color. Yes, but also drawings of unnerving symmetry, of figures with too long limbs, or eyes that were simply black voids. A young girl, perhaps 10, with dark, watchful eyes and a smudge of crimson on her cheek, observed me silently from a shadowy alcove. This was Mila. Nearby, a slightly older boy with a defiant tilt to his chin, Joey, openly stared. Reed Holloway, the art therapist, was an island of curated cheerfulness in this ocean of gray. He emerged from a brightly lit room, the scent of turpentine and linseed oil clinging to him like a second skin. His smile was wide, his manner easy, and he wore thin, paint-stained cotton gloves. Elias, welcome. The children have been so eager to meet you. His voice was a warm balm, though his eyes, a shade too bright, never quite lost a certain assessing sharpness. His art room, glimpsed through the open door, was a riot of color and light, a stark contrast to the rest of the institution. Later, Mrs. Gable, the matronly, soon-to-retire administrator, whose face seemed permanently etched with a weary resignation, handed me a typed sheet of paper. The usual guidelines, Mr. Wren, she'd said, her voice low, avoiding eye contact. And these particular house rules, Mr. Hemlock insisted, for your own smooth transition. The 3 rules, precisely as Hemlock had forewarned. Her emphasis on smooth transition felt less like a wish and more like a thinly veiled threat. That first night, alone in my small cottage, the wind seemed to whisper names around the ill-fitting window frames. When I did my initial walk-through of the dormitory wing, the old corridor stretched before me like the gullets of some sleeping beast. A sudden, unnatural cold spot in the hallway near the older, disused section made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I fumbled in my pocket for the crucifix Mrs. Gable had vaguely mentioned I should procure. It wasn't there. I hadn't thought to get one yet. The cold deepened, and a faint, almost inaudible sigh seemed to brush past my ear. I quickened my pace. The rhythm of St. Albini began to assert itself, a monotonous cycle of mealtimes, lessons, and the muted, supervised play of children who seemed to carry a collective, unspoken burden. I tried to adhere to the rules, their quiet absurdity a constant, unsettling hum beneath the surface of my duties. The crucifix was the first I addressed. The orphanage had a small, dusty chapel, largely unused. In its dim recesses, I found Brother Kellen, the librarian. He was an ancient man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes holding a profound, sorrowful wisdom. He was mute, communicating through gestures and painstakingly written notes. When I gestured, explaining my need, he looked at me with an unnerving intensity, then produced a small, worn crucifix of dark, heavy wood from the folds of his cassock. He pressed it into my palm, his own hand surprisingly cold, and then, with trembling fingers, scrawled on a scrap of paper, "Matron fears true blood. Ink is not enough." The words cryptic and chilling offered no comfort. The second rule became a nightly ritual of dread. Tucking the children in, I'd force myself to kneel, to peer into the Stygian blackness beneath each narrow bed. Usually there was nothing but dust motes dancing in the beam of my small penlight, and the occasional lost sock. But one night, under Mila Thatcher's bed, my light caught them. Two small, bare feet, side by side. Mila was in her bed above, her breathing soft and even. These other feet, pale and still, were attached to nothing visible. As I stared, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. They twitched, then slowly, deliberately, retracted deeper into the impenetrable shadow, as if an unseen puppeteer had pulled their strings. When I managed to speak, my voice a dry croak, Mila murmured in her sleep, her words shockingly clear. "If you see two, Mr. Wren, you must know which one isn't dreaming." I rose, a cold sweat drenching my shirt, pretending I'd merely been checking for drafts. Mila, I noticed, was an incessant artist. Her preferred medium was a single, vivid crimson pencil, clutched tight in her small hand. Her drawings, pinned to the bulletin board with a defiant flourish, were ostensibly of flowers, houses, other children, but always there was a disquieting element, a shadow looming too large behind a smiling stick figure. Trees with grasping, skeletal branches, a sun that wept red tears. The crimson was the color of fresh blood, stark against the cheap paper. A few days later, another boy, a quiet 7-year-old named Samuel, proudly showed me a drawing I'd made in Reed Holloway's art class. It was a portrait of Reed himself, rendered with an unsettling, almost photographic accuracy for a child his age. Reed was smiling, his head tilted in that characteristic friendly way. But his eyes, Samuel had captured their brightness, yes, but also something else. A fixed, unblinking intensity. As I looked, I had the distinct, chilling sensation that the eyes in the drawing were not looking at Samuel, but past him, directly at me. That night, checking under Samuel's bed revealed only dust, but the air in his small section of the dormitory felt colder, emptier. A subtle wrongness began to permeate St. Albane, like a creeping stain. The children's artwork, those countless pinned-up testaments to young imaginations, started to shift. I'd walk down a corridor in the morning and notice a detail in a familiar drawing had altered overnight. A smiling face in a group portrait would now bear a downturned, sorrowful mouth. The vibrant blue of a painted sky would be muted, imbued with a bruised, stormy gray. Sometimes, a figure would be missing entirely, leaving a faint, smudged outline where it once stood, as if imperfectly erased. I tried to convince myself it was tricks of memory, the play of light in these perpetually dim hallways. But the conviction grew. The canvases were not static. The children themselves began to exhibit unsettling lapses. Names, once familiar, would be fumbled, forgotten. Mila once called Samuel Timothy, then looked confused when he didn't respond. Another child, a boisterous girl named Clara, insisted for an entire afternoon that her best friend, who sat beside her at every meal, was named Lily, a name no one else recognized. Some of the younger ones started referring to me not as Mr. Wren, but as the Picture Man, or sometimes, in hushed, fearful tones, the Keeper of the Red Key. Though I carried no such item, and red was a color conspicuously absent from the orphanage strap decor, save for Mila's ever-present crimson pencil. My search for answers led me back to Brother Kellen and the orphanage's neglected library, a repository of crumbling ledgers and forgotten histories. The official records of St. Albine were sparse, sanitized, but tucked away in a locked cabinet Kellen reluctantly opened for me were older, handwritten journals. They spoke of a white lady, a pale matron, a figure from the orphanage's earliest days in the late 19th century, a woman of rumored dark practices involving the most vulnerable children who met a fiery, unlamented end. The descriptions of her appearance, a flowing white and black gown, long, unbound hair, a face of bone china pallor, sent a chill of recognition through me. echoing the unsettling forms I sometimes glimpsed in the more disturbing children's art. Joey Maddox, the sharp-eyed, rebellious older boy, found me there one afternoon. He was wary, but there was a desperate intelligence in his gaze. "It's Mr. Holloway," he whispered. After ensuring we were alone, the scent of old paper and dust thick around us. He talks to them, the quiet ones, the ones who draw. Different. He tells them to draw what they really see, not just what's there. Joey's eyes darted towards a particularly unsettling finger, painting on a nearby wall, a swirl of black and crimson that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. "He doesn't just teach art, Mr. Wren. I think he's unlocking something in the pictures." That evening, I saw Mila in a quiet corner of the common room, her crimson pencil flying across a fresh sheet of paper. She was humming a tuneless little song, a habit I'd noticed when she was deeply engrossed. Curious, I approached. She hastily covered her drawing, but not before I caught a glimpse. It was a crude, childlike rendering, yet unmistakably, horrifyingly clear. A stick figure, recognizably male, with my own slightly unruly brown hair, hanging from a gibbet. His drawn eyes were wide, black, empty. Mila looked up at me, her own eyes unreadable, then quickly turned back to her work, the crimson pencil scratching. I told myself it was nothing, a child's dark fantasy, but the image burned itself onto my retinas. The unease at St. Albine began to solidify, constricting around me like a cold, invisible hand. The third rule, don't let the children draw you in their pictures, had transformed from a curious instruction into a palpable, pressing dread. Lily, a sweet, shy girl who usually greeted me with a hesitant smile, suddenly became withdrawn, her eyes darting away whenever I approached. One afternoon, I found her in the deserted playroom, her small back to me hunched over a sketchbook. The telltale crimson of Mila's favorite pencil was in her hand. My heart lurched. "Lily," I said, my voice softer than I intended. She jumped, whirling around, her face a mask of panic. She tried to hide the sketchbook, but I saw it, a nascent, clumsy outline of a man's face, my face, the beginnings of my features, traced in that vivid, blood-like red. "Oh, Lily, no," I said, a strange coldness seeping through me. "Mr. Holloway says the caretakers don't like being in pictures. It's a privacy thing." The lie felt clumsy on my tongue, but Lily's reaction was immediate and startling. The terror in her eyes dissolved, replaced by an almost fervent relief. She nodded quickly, wordlessly, and slammed the sketchbook shut. The encounter left me deeply unsettled. Why such fear? And why the specific instruction about me? Samuel, the boy who had drawn Reed Holloway with such unnerving accuracy, was visibly fading, not physically, but in some essential, vital way. His laughter, once frequent, was now rare and hollow. His interactions were listless, his eyes often unfocused, as if seeing something beyond the grimy walls of the orphanage. One evening, as I was performing the nightly ritual of checking under the beds, my penlight beam fell on Samuel's space. Two Samuels lay there, one in the bed, breathing shallowly, a pale imitation of the boy I knew. The other, beneath the bed, was an exact replica, its eyes wide open, unblinking, fixed on me with an expression of serene, chilling emptiness. Its chest did not move. As I stared, paralyzed, the lips of the underbed Samuel curved into a slow, knowing smile. Then it simply dissolved, like mist in sunlight, leaving only dust and shadow. The next morning, the Samuel in the bed moved, spoke, ate. But he wasn't Samuel. Not anymore. The spark was gone. His eyes, when they met mine, were as vacant as the replicas had been. The disappearance of Joey Maddox was the final brutal confirmation. Reed Holloway reported finding the art room in disarray, paint spilled, canvases slashed, and Joey, sullen and defiant, was confined to the quiet room in the infirmary wing. When I went to check on him later that evening, bringing a contraband cookie, the room was empty, spotless, as if no one had been there for days. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of how he might have left the locked room. Only on the small, cloudy mirror above the wash basin, a single, childlike handprint in what looked chillingly like dried blood, and beneath it, scrolled backwards, as if written by someone looking out of the mirror. Not a child, something else. A frantic search of the art room's refused. Then later that night yielded a torn fragment of a canvas. It was a portrait, clearly in Reed's more sophisticated style, of a young woman with tired eyes and a forced smile. Miss Albright, the caretaker who had, according to Mrs. Gable, resigned without notice just before my arrival. Her painted eye stared out from the canvas fragment with an expression of mute, unending terror. The rest of her, the majority of the portrait, was gone, erased. The torn portrait of Miss Albright, the chilling message on the mirror. They were no longer isolated anomalies, but pieces of a horrifying, coalescing truth. Brother Kellen, sensing my growing desperation, finally shared his deepest secret. From a hollowed-out ancient Bible in the library, he retrieved a slim, leather-bound diary, its pages brittle, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. It was the journal of Brother Thomas, a monk who had served St. Albine a century ago. A man who had tried and failed to combat the entity he called Mater Lacrimarum, the mother of tears, the pale matron. His writings were a fractured, terrified account of a being intrinsically bound to the orphanage's very foundations, an entity that fed on the sorrow and innocence of children, that sought to manifest through their fears and their art. She must be seen to be, Brother Thomas had scrawled, rendered anew by innocent hands, for her old form is but shadow and ash. The canvas is her doorway, the child's eye her window. The matron, burned for her necromantic rites with the orphans of her time, was a parasitic echo, needing to be redrawn into existence. Armed with this terrifying knowledge, I confronted Reed Holloway. I found him in the art room, the air thick with the usual smells of paint and solvent, but also, tonight, an undercurrent of something else. That cloying, sickly sweetness I'd come to associate with the orphanage's deeper malignancy. He was standing before a large easel draped with a canvas sheet, humming softly to himself, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. "Joey's gone, Reed," I said, my voice tight. The crucifix Brother Kellen had given me clutched in my pocket, its wood warm against my palm. Just like Miss Albright, just like countless others, I suspect, over the years. Reed turned, his smile as serene and practiced as ever, but his eyes held a new, feverish light. Ah, Elias, always so observant. Joey had such potential, such a vibrant, tormented little soul. He saw things so clearly. What did you do to him, Reed? What are you doing to these children? He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Doing? I am an artist, Elias. I am a conduit. I simply guide them, help them express what is already inside. Help them express what is already inside. The matron, she appreciates true talent. She understands the power of a perfectly rendered fear, a truly captured sorrow. He gestured to the draped easel. She has been incomplete for so long, a sketch waiting for her final lines. The truth, when it came, was more twisted than I could have imagined. Reed, it turned out, was not merely aware of the pale matron. He was her devotee, her high priest. His gloves, I realized with a sickening lurch, weren't for cleanliness or allergies. They were to hide the ritualistic scars, the small, self-inflicted cuts from which he would bless certain canvases with his own blood, awakening them, making them more receptive to the matron's influence. His own childhood had been a canvas of torment, orchestrated by a mother who saw artistic genius in her son's pain. He hadn't found solace in art. He'd found a perverse reflection of his own suffering. And in the pale matron, a dark muse who promised to elevate that suffering into something eternal. "She chose me, Elias," Reed whispered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "Just as she chooses the children with the truest sight, I help them give form to her essence, and in return their souls, their art, it lives forever, unchanged." "Perfect." He pulled the sheet from the easel. The painting beneath was monstrous. It was a portrait, rendered with a chilling, almost photorealistic detail of the pale matron. She stood in her Victorian morning gown, black lace stark against the unearthly white of her skin. Her long dark hair, unkempt, seemed to writhe like snakes, touching the floor. Her face was a smooth, bone-white oval, devoid of eyes, yet somehow I felt an intense, malevolent gaze emanating from it. Her long, skeletal fingers, tipped with nails like shards of obsidian, dripped a viscous, black ichor. The background was a swirling vortex of suffering faces. Children's faces, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams, and woven into the fabric of her gown, almost imperceptible at first, were the visages of Miss Albright, of Joey, of Samuel, their features distorted, absorbed. "She needs to be fully seen, Elias," Reed said, his voice now imbued with that same unnatural resonance I'd heard from the depths of Tunnel 7 in Black Hollow. "To be anchored in this reality. And for that, she needs a final willing portrait, one infused with a strong living spirit." As he spoke, the temperature in the room plummeted. The paint on the canvases around the room began to bubble and run, the colors darkening, bleeding into each other. The children's cheerful drawings warped, their smiling figures contorting into grotesque parodies. Mila Thatcher stood in the doorway, her eyes glazed, her crimson pencil clutched in her hand. She was working on a small sketch pad, her movements jerky, unnatural. She was drawing me. The pale matron in the painting moved, her lipless mouth stretched into an impossible silent shriek. One of her long, blood-tipped fingers extended from the canvas, elongating, a tendril of living shadow reaching out into the room. It brushed against a nearby stack of finished artwork, and the drawings instantly curled and blackened, as if touched by acid. "Mila, child, he's ready now," Reed crooned, his gaze fixed on me with a predatory intensity. "Draw, Mr. Wren. Draw his lovely, troubled soul for our mother." Mila's pencil scratched faster, the crimson lines defining my unwilling likeness with terrifying speed. I could feel a coldness seeping into me, a psychic drain, as if my very essence were being siphoned onto the page. The matron's painted form seemed to swell, to become more substantial. I fumbled for the crucifix. Reed laughed, a high, crackling sound. "Oh, that little trinket. She appreciates faith, Elias. It makes the soul so much richer." But as I pulled it out, my hand, scraped raw during my earlier frantic search through the library, brushed against the sharp edge of the wooden cross. A smear of my own fresh blood, bright red, stained its surface. I shoved it forward towards the advancing tendril from the painting. The effect was instantaneous. The matron's shadowy limb recoiled as if burned, a silent hiss like escaping steam, emanating from the canvas. The painted figure flickered, its form momentarily losing cohesion. Brother Kellen's words echoed in my mind. Matron fears true blood. This wasn't just a symbol. It was a conduit for something vital she couldn't tolerate. Reed's smile vanished, replaced by a snarl of fury. "No, you will not ruin this. She is almost complete." He lunged not at me, but at Mila, grabbing her small hand, trying to force the crimson pencil across the nearly finished sketch of my face. Mila cried out, a small frightened sound. This was it. The painting, the ritual, my life. It all hung on these next few desperate seconds. I had to destroy that conduit, that final damning portrait of myself. And somehow, I had to reach the child before Reed and his dark muse consumed her completely. Reed's grip on Mila's wrist was like iron, his face a mask of fanatical desperation. The pale matron, momentarily repulsed by the blood on the crucifix, was already reasserting her terrifying presence. The painted ichor on her fingers sizzling as new tendrils of shadow began to ooze from the canvas, reaching, probing. The air in the art room was thick with her malevolence, a palpable, suffocating cold. Mila's crimson sketch of me was nearly complete. I could feel a horrifying tug, a sensation of my own vitality being drawn towards that small, damning rectangle of paper. There was no time for finesse, no room for hesitation. My earlier frantic search through the orphanage's poorly maintained storage rooms had yielded not just Brother Thomas's diary, but also a rusted can of turpentine and another of linseed oil, remnants of some long-forgotten art project. They sat on a nearby supply shelf. "Let her go, Reed," I yelled, my voice raw. I lunged, not at Reed, but at that shelf. With a sweep of my arm, I sent the cans clattering to the floor. Turpentine, oily and pungent, gushed across the wooden floorboards, quickly followed by the thicker, stickier linseed oil. The fumes were immediate, acrid. Reed, momentarily distracted by my sudden action, loosened his grip on Mila. "What are you doing, fool?" he shrieked, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You'll destroy it all. The perfection." "Some things aren't meant to be perfect, Reed." I snatched a discarded rag, a forgotten paint-splattered cloth, from a workbench. The matron's shadowy tendrils were now inches from Mila, who stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror. My own nearly finished portrait on her sketch pad pulsed with a faint, unholy light. I had to break her connection to it. I grabbed the sketch pad from Mila's unresisting hand, the paper strangely cold, thrumming with a faint, repellent energy. With my other hand, I fumbled for the Zippo lighter I always carried, a relic from a past I rarely thought about. The matron on the large canvas let out a silent, psychic scream that reverberated through my skull. Her entire form seemed to surge forward, her featureless face contorting in an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. Reed, realizing my intent, abandoned Mila and charged at me, his gloved hands outstretched like claws. "The mistress will not be denied," he snarled, his voice no longer human, but a chorus of harsh, guttural whispers. He was fast, but desperation lent me speed. I flicked the Zippo. The flame caught on the rag, small at first, then blossoming. Reed slammed into me. We both stumbled, the lit rag flying from my hand. It landed squarely in the spreading pool of turpentine and oil. The world erupted in a whoosh of orange and yellow. Flames leaped up the walls with terrifying speed, devouring the children's artwork, the canvases curling and blackening, their painted smiles melting into grotesque, screaming grimaces. The heat was instantaneous, brutal. Reed screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and fury, as flames licked at his paint-stained clothes. He thrashed, trying to beat them out, but the oils made him a human torch. The pale matron in the master portrait shrieked again, her painted form writhing, blistering, the canvas beginning to char and peel away from the frame. The shadowy tendrils retracted, sizzling and dissolving as they touched the encroaching fire. My first priority was Mila. I grabbed her, shielding her small body with my own, and shoved her towards the door. "Run, Mila! Get out!" Then I turned back to the inferno. The sketch of me, the one Mila had nearly completed, lay on the floor near the spreading flames, still pulsing with that faint, malevolent light. It was the anchor. I had to destroy it. Ignoring the searing heat, the choking smoke, I lunged for it. My hand closed around the sketch pad just as the edge of it began to smolder. The matron's psychic assault intensified, a wave of pure despair and icy rage washing over me, trying to paralyze me. I could see her, not just in the burning master portrait, but in my mind's eye, a withered ancient thing of ash and spite, her power unraveling. With a defiant roar, I thrust the sketchpad deep into the heart of the roaring fire. The paper ignited instantly, the crimson lines of my portrait flaring brightly for a moment before being consumed by black char. As it burned, I felt a profound psychic snap, as if a cord connecting me to something vast and malevolent had been violently severed. The pressure in my skull vanished. The matron's master portrait was now a roaring pyre, her painted form contorting into a final, silent rictus of agony before dissolving into ash and embers. Reed Holloway lay a few feet away, a smoldering, unrecognizable heap. The art room was an inferno. Coughing, my eyes streaming, I stumbled out, half carrying a now limp, traumatized Mila. The screams of other children, the frantic shouts of the few remaining staff, echoed down the corridors as smoke billowed through St. Albine. The fire alarm, an ancient clanging bell, finally began its belated useless clamor. The cleansing fire. It was a terrible, desperate absolution. The wail of sirens, when it finally cut through the night, was the sound of a world intruding, a world that could never comprehend the true nature of the inferno it had come to fight. St. Albine Orphanage, or what was left of its oldest wing, burned with a furious, almost sentient intensity. The firefighters, grim-faced and efficient, battled the blaze, their powerful hoses an inadequate counterpoint to the unholy energies that had been unleashed and perhaps partially consumed. I sat on the damp grass of the lawn, Mila wrapped in a coarse fire blanket beside me, her small body trembling uncontrollably. She hadn't spoken a word since we'd escaped the art room. Other children, wide-eyed and terrified, were huddled nearby, tended to by the shell-shocked remnants of the staff. Mrs. Gable was there, her face a mask of horrified disbelief, muttering about faulty wiring, about old buildings. The official story, when it eventually solidified from the ashes and interrogations, would be just that. Faulty wiring, a tragic accident. Elias Wren, the relatively new caretaker, was a hero for having rescued several children, though perhaps a little careless, leaving flammable art supplies unsecured. Reed Holloway, the beloved art therapist, was a tragic victim. Unable to escape the blaze he might have unknowingly exacerbated. There was no mention of the pale matron, no talk of cursed canvases or blood rituals. The world preferred its horrors neat, explicable. St. Albine was condemned, its blackened shell a monument to secrets best left buried. The children were dispersed, sent to other facilities, other towns, carrying with them scars that no official report could ever document. I cooperated with the inquiries, my answers carefully vague, sticking to the accepted narrative. To speak the truth would have been to invite a different kind of confinement. In the aftermath, a strange quiet settled over me. The whispers from Sunnyside seemed distant, their power diminished. The matron's presence, that constant cold pressure, was gone. I had faced something elemental, something ancient, and survived. The crucifix Brother Kellen had given me was lost in the chaos, but I no longer felt the acute need for its tangible comfort. The real battle, I understood, had been fought with will, with sacrifice, and with the desperate protective rage of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. Years passed. I moved on, found work in a quiet bookstore in a distant city. I rarely thought of St. Albine, or at least I tried not to. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the silence of my small apartment was too profound, I would catch a faint, almost imperceptible scent. Antiseptic, old stone, and the faintest, sweetest hint of something burning. One blustery autumn afternoon, browsing a dusty antique shop, my fingers brushed against a small, velvet-lined box. Inside, nestled on faded satin, was a child's sketchbook, its pages filled with crude, vibrant drawings, mostly flowers, animals. But on the very last page, rendered in a single, vivid crimson pencil, was a drawing of a house. A tall, Gothic house with narrow, empty windows. And in one of those windows, almost hidden in the shadows, stood a tiny stick-figure woman in a long, dark dress. I closed the sketchbook, a coldness seeping into my bones that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. The matron was ash, her power broken at St. Albine, but her idea, her essence perhaps could be redrawn, recalled. The canvas was wide, and there were always innocent hands, and always new walls waiting for new pictures. The art, it seemed, was never truly finished. And somewhere, always, a crimson pencil waited. They say the mountains hide their secrets, but some secrets don't want to stay hidden. Welcome to the Ghost Line, a remote tour bus route winding through the Rocky Mountains, where the scenery is breathtaking and the price of passage is terrifying. My name is Micah Trent, a driver looking for an escape, but I found myself bound by 3 strange rules just to stay alive. What's the scariest thing you've ever seen on a road trip? Tell me in the comments below. And if you're ready to take a ride on the Ghost Line, subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules and ring that bell. Because up here, the road doesn't just lead to Yellowstone. It leads somewhere else. The journey begins now. They say the mountains keep secrets. And after that last run through the Rockies, I know it's truer than any map could tell. I took the job driving tour buses between Colorado and Yellowstone to escape my own ghosts, figuring the endless pines and granite peaks would be a quiet penance for the twisted metal and the sirens that still screamed in my sleep. But this route, the one snaking through forgotten passes and past skeletal mining towns, came with its own set of commandments. 3 rules, etched into the grime of the driver's sun visor and the previous driver's shaky hand, supposedly to keep us alive. The air up there is thin, the radio signals die without warning, and the silence, well, the silence isn't always empty. Jake, the driver I replaced, he always scoffed at the 3rd rule, the one about the lumberjacks. They found his bus empty on a clear morning, door swinging in the breeze, a fresh layer of impossible antique axe marks on the nearest pine. My name is Micah Trent. The weight of 3 lives lost under my command on a rain-slicked highway still sat heavy on my soul, a debt I figured I'd be paying off for eternity. This gig, piloting a gleaming MCI coach full of sightseers, felt like a parody of responsibility. But the solitude of the long drives, the rhythmic drone of the engine, it was a balm of sorts. Old man Hemlock, the dispatcher back at the depot, a man whose face seemed carved from petrified wood, had just grunted when he handed me the keys for the Ghost Line run. "Run? She's got her quirks, this route," he'd rasped, tapping a yellowed laminated card tucked into the visor. "Pay mine to mountains don't suffer fools." The rules were stark, almost childish in their bluntness. Never pick up hitchhikers wearing old mining gear after sunset. If you smell cooking meat but see no campfire, speed up immediately. When lumberjacks from the 1800s board your bus, they're the best guide you'll ever have. I'd almost laughed. Seemed like the kind of local folklore you'd tell tourists to spook them. But Jake's empty bus, that wasn't folklore. The current manifest was a typical mix. An elderly woman, Martha Bellamy, clutched a worn leather pouch that smelled faintly of dried herbs and muttered to herself as she boarded, her eyes darting nervously towards the darkening peaks. A young man, Tyler Nunn, all swagger and expensive sunglasses, loudly proclaimed his disbelief in anything he couldn't film on his phone. And then there was Alma Navarro, the tour company's assigned guide, young, bright-eyed, with an encyclopedic knowledge of geological formations and a disconcerting fondness for tales of lost prospectors. Our first major stop was Greaves Hollow, a cluster of weathered buildings huddled in a narrow valley, a place that seemed to exist outside of time. Harlan Greaves, the proprietor, emerged from the combination gas station and curio shop, a man whose smile didn't quite reach his eyes that were the color of a stormy mountain lake. He was full of folksy charm and tall tales, spinning yarns about phantom miners and whispering winds as he topped off the diesel. "Some say old Copper Hill up yonder still has a heartbeat," he chuckled, gesturing towards a distant, forbidding ridge. "Mighty pretty detour up that way, if you're not in a hurry. Cuts a few miles off, and the view's breathtaking." He winked, a gesture that felt less friendly and more conspiratorial. Despite a prickle of unease I couldn't quite name, the lure of a shortcut and breathtaking views swayed the schedule. As we pulled out of Greaves Hollow onto a narrow, unpaved track that clearly hadn't seen much traffic, Martha Bellamy leaned forward, her voice a low tremor. "This road, driver, it smells of old sorrows, and the air, it's heavy. Like before a A bad storm. But there ain't no clouds. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Reeves was standing by his gas pumps, watching us go, his figure shrinking in the distance. He wasn't smiling anymore. The track Harlan Greaves had called a road was more of a scar on the mountainside. Winding ever upward, the pines pressed close, their ancient branches blotting out the sky, and the reliable chatter of the CB radio dissolved into an infuriating hiss of static. Cell service had evaporated miles back. We were alone, a fragile bubble of humanity in an indifferent, primordial wilderness. The bus's engine, usually a comforting growl, seemed loud, almost intrusive in the profound silence. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the jagged peaks, it started. A smell, rich and savory, wafting through the open driver's window, cooking meat distinctly, like a spit-roasted hog or a thick steak sizzling over an open flame. My stomach rumbled reflexively before my mind caught up. "Anyone else smell barbecue?" Tyler Noon called from the back, his voice tinged with hopeful hunger. Several passengers murmured in agreement. I scanned the dense forest on either side of the track. Nothing. No wisp of smoke, no flicker of firelight, no sign of human habitation for miles. Just the deepening gloom and the endless silent trees. Rule number 2. If you smell cooking meat but see no campfire, speed up immediately. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, cut through me. I pressed down on the accelerator. The big diesel engine roared in protest as we picked up speed, the bus lurching on the uneven track. "Hey, what's the rush, pal?" Tyler yelled, annoyed. "Maybe there's a diner up ahead." "Just trying to make up time," I lied. My knuckles white on the steering wheel. The scent was stronger now, cloyingly sweet, almost overpowering. It filled the cabin, thick and greasy. Marta Bellamy was pale, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. She was fumbling in her herb pouch, her lips moving in a silent prayer. I risked a glance at the passengers. A few looked queasy. One man, a quiet accountant type who'd been buried in a book since we left Denver, suddenly gasped, his face ashen. "I feel strange," he stammered, his hand clutching his chest, like something's been scooped out of me. His eyes were unfocused, his breathing shallow. The smell was everywhere, inescapable. It wasn't just meat anymore. There was an undertone of something else, something coppery and burnt, like overcooked blood. I pushed the accelerator to the floor, the bus careening dangerously close to the edge of the narrow track. Then, as quickly as it had come, the smell vanished, sucked away by the mountain wind, leaving behind only the scent of pine, damp earth, and a lingering, bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the falling temperature. The accountant type slumped in his seat, his eyes closed, his color slowly, too slowly, returning. He wouldn't remember this moment. I knew with a sickening certainty. He'd just feel a little weaker, a little more hollow. The encounter with the Phantom Feast left an unspoken tension hanging heavy in the recycled air of the bus. Passengers whispered amongst themselves, casting uneasy glances out at the encroaching darkness. The peaks around us were now silhouetted giants against a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Sunset in the Rockies could be beautiful, but tonight it felt like a warning. We rounded a sharp, blind curve, the bus groaning under the strain, and there he was, standing by the side of the narrow track. Barely visible in the dying light was a figure, tall and gaunt, clad in what looked like faded, bib-style overalls and a battered felt hat of a design I hadn't seen outside of old photographs. A rusty pickaxe was propped against his leg. He raised a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture. A hitchhiker? Rule number 1. Never pick up hitchhikers wearing old mining gear after sunset. "Hey driver, stop." Tyler Noon was on his feet, pointing. "Look, an old prospector. Poor guy is probably stranded. We gotta help him." Other passengers murmured agreement, their earlier fear momentarily forgotten in a surge of misguided compassion. My gut clenched. The man's silhouette was all wrong. The way he stood, too still, too patient. The gear, it wasn't just old. It looked ancient. Company policy, I said, my voice harsher than I intended. No unscheduled stops on these remote routes, especially after dark. Policy. Are you kidding me? Tyler scoffed, striding down the aisle. He could freeze out here. It's basic human decency, man. I kept my eyes on the road, on the figure that didn't move, didn't react to our approach. I could feel the weight of the passengers' disapproval, but Jake's empty bus, the ominous visor rules. They were a louder voice in my head. As we drew level with him, I risked a quick glance. His face was in deep shadow beneath the brim of his hat, but what I could see of it seemed unfinished, featureless, and the lamp clipped to the front of his hat, an old carbide type. It wasn't lit, yet I could have sworn I saw a faint, cold light flickering deep within the twin hollows where his eyes should have been. I accelerated past him. Tyler swore loudly. Mata Bellamy, however, let out a small shuddering sigh of relief and began to audibly mumble what sounded like a psalm. 100 yards down the track, I looked in the large side view mirror. The figure was still standing there, unmoving, watching us recede. Or rather, the dark shape of his head was turned in our direction. He hadn't lowered his hand. It remained raised as if frozen in that gesture of summons, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw other similar figures stepping out from the deep shadows of the pines behind him, their forms indistinct, their mining gear glinting dully in the last rays of the dying sun. The rest of the night passed in a strained silence. Tyler sulked. The accountant type from earlier, whose name I now realized I couldn't quite recall, stared blankly out the window, a thin line of drool tracing from the corner of his mouth. He looked diminished. When we finally found a semi-level clearing to pull over for a mandated rest break, the mountain air was frigid, the silence absolute, broken only by the nervous coughing of a few passengers. The stars, when I stepped outside the bus, were brilliant, cold, and impossibly distant, like the eyes of indifferent gods. Dawn broke cold and gray, the sun struggling to penetrate the high-altitude haze. The enforced stop had done little to ease the tension. Sleep had been fitful for everyone, punctuated by the unsettling silence of the deep wilderness. As Alma Navarro attempted a cheerful head count before we set off again, her smile faltered. "Wait a minute," she said, her brow furrowed, counting again on her fingers. "We're one short." A ripple of unease went through the remaining passengers. We counted. She was right. Someone was missing. But who? A strange collective amnesia seemed to settle over the group. Faces looked blank. People struggled to recall who exactly had been sitting in the now empty seat towards the back. The accountant type. The one who'd felt ill after the phantom smell of cooking meat. His name, his face, the details of his presence had become frustratingly, unnervingly vague to everyone. It was as if he'd been carefully, surgically erased from their recent memories. Everyone except me. And Martha. It was Mr. Henderson, Martha whispered, her voice trembling, her knuckles white as she clutched her herb pouch. Arthur Henderson. He sat right there. Said he was going to see the geysers. He looked so pale last night. I remembered him. His quiet demeanor, the way his eyes had glazed over. I walked to the empty seat. The upholstery felt unnaturally cold, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. And on the floor beneath it, almost invisible against the dark carpet, was a small smear of damp, reddish-brown mud. It wasn't the loamy soil of the forest around us. It was clay-like with a faint, coppery scent. The kind of mud you'd find deep underground. My mud. A horrifying suspicion began to coalesce in my mind. Harlan Greaves, his overly friendly demeanor, his insistence on this shortcut, the almost predatory gleam in his eyes. He hadn't just suggested a detour, he'd herded us. For what purpose? As if on cue, the mountain decided to compound our problems. A thick, impenetrable fog rolled in with unnatural speed, swallowing the landscape, reducing visibility to mere feet. The narrow track, already treacherous, became a death trap. I was forced to stop the bus, the engine idling, a small, fragile island of warmth and light in a sea of disorienting white. We were utterly, completely lost. Alma, ever resourceful, produced a compass and a faded topographical map she'd brought along. If we can find a landmark, a stream, anything. She murmured more to herself than anyone else. She stepped out of the bus, disappearing into the swirling gray almost immediately. A few minutes later, she returned, her face etched with a new layer of confusion. Accent blazes on the trees, but they're old, really old, like 19th century old. They're leading deeper into the woods, not towards any road on this map. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. And the silence. It's like the fog itself is eating the sound. The sense of being watched, of being in a place where the normal rules of reality were fraying at the edges, was becoming overwhelming. Greaves had deliberately led us into a trap, and whatever haunted these mountains, whatever had claimed Arthur Henderson, was now closing in. The fog felt alive, a suffocating blanket pressing down, isolating us further with every passing moment, and somewhere in that white void I knew the Watchers were waiting. The fog was a living entity, coiling and shifting, its tendrils probing the bus, muffling our voices, amplifying the frantic thumping of my own heart. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time itself seemed to warp in that disorienting white void. Panic, a cold, slimy creature, began to slither amongst the remaining passengers. Some wept quietly. Others stared out into the impenetrable gray with a vacant, hopeless expression. Marta Bellamy's prayers were a constant, low murmur, a fragile shield against the encroaching dread. Then, through the oppressive silence came a new sound, the rhythmic, melancholic creak of unoiled wheels, the soft thud of heavy hooves on damp earth, and the faint, almost imperceptible jingle of harness. Lights appeared, hazy and indistinct at first, then resolving into the warm, flickering glow of several old-fashioned storm lanterns bobbing in the ghostly whiteness. From out of the fog, figures emerged, tall, broad-shouldered men, clad in heavy wool trousers, checked flannel shirts, and wide-brimmed hats that shadowed their faces. They carried long-handled axes, gleaming faintly in the lantern light. One led a pair of massive draft horses, their breath pluming in the cold air, hitched to a sturdy, if ancient-looking, logging sled. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, their expressions, or what little I could see of them in the shifting fog and dim light, unreadable, weathered like old timber. There were perhaps half a dozen of them, lumberjacks, straight out of the 19th century. Rule number 3, when lumberjacks from the 1800s board your bus, they're the best guide you'll ever have. A collective gasp went through the bus. Fear, yes, but also a strange, dawning flicker of something else. Hope, or just a different kind of terror. Alma Navarro, who had been peering intently through the fogged-up windshield, was the first to speak, her voice awed. "It's them," she whispered, her eyes wide. The trail markers. They weren't just old. They were their markers. The lead lumberjack, a man with a great gray beard that cascaded down his chest, approached the driver's side window. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, his gaze hidden in the deep shadows of his hat brim, fixed on me. He raised a gnarled hand and gestured, a slow, deliberate sweep of his arm, indicating a barely perceptible track leading away from our current position, deeper into the fog-shrouded forest. He said nothing. None of them did. Their silence was as profound and ancient as the mountains themselves. My mind raced. This was insane. Apparitions. Ghosts. Yet, the rule. Jake's empty bus. The grim certainty that we were already ensnared in something far beyond normal comprehension. I looked at Alma. She nodded, a silent affirmation of the unbelievable. "All right, everyone," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "It seems we have some assistance. We're going to follow them." As I carefully eased the bus forward, guided by the bobbing lanterns of the silent lumberjacks. The atmosphere inside the vehicle shifted. The oppressive fear didn't vanish, but it was now overlaid with a surreal, almost dreamlike quality. We were in their hands now, these silent sentinels of the lost paths. The track they led us on was rough, barely a trail, but they moved with an unerring confidence, their lanterns cutting a path through the suffocating fog. And then the smell returned. That sickeningly sweet, acrid scent of cooking meat, stronger this time, more urgent, laced with that unmistakable coppery tang of blood. It billowed around us, thick and nauseating. There, close. Martha Bellamy whimpered, clutching her herb pouch so tightly her knuckles were white. The hungry ones. Almost immediately, as if summoned by her words, figures began to coalesce at the edges of the lantern light, just beyond the perimeter of our strange spectral convoy. Gaunt shapes in tattered mining gear, their faces lost in the featureless black pits beneath their helmet brims, the cold, dead light of their carbide lamps flickering like malevolent stars. The hollow men. They didn't rush us, they paced us. Shadows in the fog, their movements disturbingly fluid, their silence more terrifying than any scream. I could feel their collective hunger, a cold, psychic pressure boring into the bus. Some of the passengers began to moan, their faces paling, their eyes glazing over with that same vacant, diminished look Arthur Henderson had worn. The lumberjacks, however, seemed oblivious to them, or perhaps defiantly unconcerned. They maintained their steady pace, their lanterns a fragile, unwavering beacon. But I noticed their grips tightened on their axes, their massive shoulders tensing almost imperceptibly. And then, stepping out from behind a colossal, fog-wreathed spruce, directly into the path of the leading lumberjack, was Harlan Greaves. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were two rough-looking men I vaguely recognized from the gas station back at Greaves Hollow. Their faces hard, their eyes holding a dull, unquestioning loyalty. Greaves himself held a modern, high-powered hunting rifle, its barrel glinting dully. His folksy charm was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian cunning. "Well now, this is an unexpected development," Greaves said, his voice smooth, but with an undercurrent of steel. He gestured with the rifle towards the lumberjacks. "Didn't reckon on you old-timers still stirring. Thought the mountain had forgotten you." He then turned his attention to my bus, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces within. "A shame, really. Such a fine offering. The men of Copper Hill have been restless. Offering? I choked out, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy tire iron I kept stowed beside my seat. "What are you talking about, Greaves?" His smile was a predatory slash. "The mountain has a price, Mr. Trent. Always has. My ancestors understood that. They fed the old veins of Copper Hill, and Copper Hill, in turn, fed us. Kept Greaves Hollow alive when other towns withered and died." He gestured vaguely towards the surrounding gloom. "These entities, the Hollow Men, they are the toll, and they require sustenance. Tourists are so plentiful after all, and so very trusting." The lead lumberjack took a slow, deliberate step forward, his shadowed face unreadable. Greaves' rifle barrel twitched, centering on the old man's chest. Now, Jedediah," Greaves purred, a chilling familiarity in his tone. "Don't go getting any heroic notions. Your time is long past. This is my valley now, my covenant." The hollow men were drawing closer, their silent advance tightening the ring around us. The scent of phantom meat was overpowering. From deeper in the fog, I could hear a faint, rhythmic sound, like digging, like the slow, inexorable advance of 100 rusty pickaxes, striking stone. It was then that Alma, her face pale but resolute, pointed towards a narrow cleft in the rock face, barely visible through the swirling mist, a path the lead lumberjack had subtly indicated just moments before Greaves' arrival. "Micah!" There! There! The passage. The game was clear. Greaves intended to sacrifice us. The hollow men were his instruments, or perhaps his masters. And the lumberjacks. They were an older power, a different kind of mountain spirit, and perhaps our only silent hope. The air crackled with unseen energies, the fog itself seeming to writhe with the conflict of ancient, hungry things. The lead lumberjack, Jedediah, didn't flinch at Greaves' rifle. He simply tilted his shadowed head, and a low sound, like the friction of ancient stones grinding together, seemed to emanate from him. It wasn't a word, but it was a clear, cold challenge. The other lumberjacks shifted, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows, their axes held at the ready. For a moment, two eons of mountain power faced off. Greaves, with his desperate, blood-soaked pact, and these silent, timeless guardians. Foolish ghosts, Greaves spat, his composure cracking. He gestured sharply to his two thugs. Keep the bus. Contained. The men will have their due. But as his men moved towards us, the hollow men, sensing the shift in dynamics, or perhaps impatient for their feast, began to close in with a terrifying, silent speed. Their featureless faces, those black pits that promised oblivion, turned towards Greaves' men. One of the thugs let out a strangled yelp as a gaunt, grimy hand, impossibly long, reached out from the fog and brushed his arm. He stumbled back, his face instantly paling, a look of vacant horror spreading across his features. He dropped his own weapon and began to babble incoherently. That was the diversion we needed. Now, I yelled to Alma, who was already at the bus door, wrestling with the emergency release. The lumberjacks moved with surprising swiftness. They didn't attack Greaves directly, but instead, two of them stepped between him and the bus, their massive forms creating a temporary, imposing barrier. Jedediah, with a final, almost imperceptible nod towards the cleft Alma had indicated, turned and swung his axe not at a person, but at the base of a towering, dead pine precariously perched on the slope above us. The sound of the impact was like a cannon shot in the unnatural quiet. The tree groaned, teetered, and then came crashing down with a sound like thunder. Not towards us, but directly onto the narrow track behind Greaves, blocking his line of retreat and kicking up a huge cloud of earth and debris. Greaves roared in fury, momentarily distracted. The hollow men, disoriented by the sudden noise and chaos, or perhaps by the lumberjacks' direct intervention, paused in their advance. Go! Go! Alma screamed, wrenching the bus door open. Open! I grabbed the tire iron, my heart hammering. Martha Bellamy was already ushering the few remaining coherent passengers towards the exit. We scrambled out of the bus and into the biting cold, the fog, and the terrifying unknown. The cleft in the rock was narrow, a dark, uninviting passage, but it was away from the immediate horror. Jedediah and his lumberjacks didn't follow. They stood their ground, a silent, immovable line between us and the seething chaos of Greaves, his now panicked remaining thug, and the advancing, insatiable hollow men. The last I saw of them, as we plunged into the darkness of the rock passage, was Jedediah raising his lantern high, its warm light a defiant pinprick against the encroaching spectral cold. He seemed to be drawing the hollow men's attention, buying us precious seconds. The passage was a rough, natural tunnel, slick with moisture and smelling of ancient, undisturbed earth. It twisted and turned, sloping steeply upwards. Behind us, we could hear muffled shouts, the inhuman chittering sounds the hollow men seemed to make when agitated, and then a single piercing scream that was abruptly cut short. Greaves, perhaps, or his last man, finally paying the mountains toll. We didn't stop. We didn't dare. The air grew thinner, colder. My lungs burned. Martha, despite her age, kept up with a surprising tenacity, her muttered prayers now imbued with a desperate fervor. Alma, using her small flashlight, guided us, her knowledge of basic geology helping her to pick the most stable-looking path. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of scrambling in the dark, we saw it, a faint, gray light ahead. We emerged, gasping, onto a high, windswept ridge, the fog thinner here, revealing a breathtaking, terrifying panorama of jagged peaks and plunging valleys under a sky slowly beginning to lighten with the false dawn. We were battered, filthy, and traumatized, but we were alive. Below us, from the direction of the Copper Hill mine and the area we just escaped, a low, guttural rumble echoed up the mountainside, a sound of immense geological displeasure, as if the very heart of the mountain was sighing in anger or repletion. Then, a profound silence fell once more, broken only by the mournful soughing of the wind through the stunted pines. The lumberjacks, our silent saviors, were nowhere to be seen. They had melted back into the mists, into the fabric of the ancient mountain, their duty, but now seemingly done. The official story, when we finally stumbled into a remote ranger station, looking like survivors of a plane crash, was met with the expected blend of disbelief and professional concern. Exposure, altitude sickness, group hysteria, the usual dismissals. Harlan Greaves and his 2 associates were listed as missing, presumed victims of a tragic accident while illegally hunting or prospecting in a dangerous, unstable area. The subsequent search parties found nothing but the abandoned bus, its interior cold and strangely empty feeling, and evidence of a localized landslide near the old Copper Hill mine workings. The area was, of course, promptly declared off limits due to geological instability. Martha Bellamy retired to a quiet life with her sister in a lowland town, her herb pouch never far from her side. She'd send me postcards occasionally, filled with fervent blessings and warnings about listening to the old ways. Alma Navarro, remarkably, stayed with the tour company, though she requested, and was granted, a transfer to less eventful routes. She told me once over a tense, coffee-fueled debrief that she'd found an old local history book that mentioned Jedediah and his crew, loggers who had perished in a freak blizzard in the winter of 1888, while trying to rescue a group of trapped miners near Copper Hill. Their bodies were never found. I tried to quit. God, how I tried. But the ghost line run, the route through those cursed mountains, it had a hold on me. Or perhaps I felt an obligation. Jake's empty bus, the rules on the visor. Someone had to know. Someone had to remember. So I kept driving, a solitary watchman on a haunted highway. The company was always short of drivers willing to take the route, especially after my incident. They didn't ask too many questions. The rules were my Bible now. I never drove that particular shortcut again, needless to say. And when the sun dipped below the peaks, my eyes scanned the roadsides with a hawk's intensity for any sign of faded overalls or unlit carbide lamps. If the wind carried the faintest, richest scent of roasting meat where no fire could be, my foot instinctively found the floor. It was about 6 months later, on a late autumn run, the peaks already dusted with early snow. I was on a different, but still remote, section of the Rockies, a good 100 miles from Copper Hill. The sun had just set, painting the sky in violent hues of purple and blood orange, and I saw him, just for a second, in my rear-view mirror. Standing by the side of the desolate, two-lane blacktop was a figure, tall, gaunt, wearing what looked like ancient mining gear. His hand was raised. My blood ran cold. This wasn't their territory, or so I'd thought. Then, as my heart hammered against my ribs from the dense twilight forest on the other side of the road, another figure stepped out. Taller, broader, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face, an axe resting on his shoulder. He didn't look at me. He looked across the road at the hitchhiker. The air in my cab, which had just plummeted, seemed to steady. The hollow man, or whatever iteration of that hunger it was, slowly lowered his hand. He hesitated, then seemed to fade back into the deepening shadows, like a bad dream receding. The lumberjack remained for a moment longer, a silent, stoic guardian. Then he too turned and melted back into the pines. I drove on, my hands shaking, the cold sweat now a clammy sheen on my skin. The mountains kept their secrets, yes, and their old accords. Their ancient, unseen battles were still being waged along these lonely roads. The rules weren't just for survival. They were a map of the peripheries, a guide to the thin places where the veils between worlds frayed. And I, Micah Trent, was just another drifter on the ghost line, forever listening for the next toll, forever watching for the silent guides in a land that never truly forgot and never fully forgave. Some theaters aren't just buildings. They're living things, built on the ghosts of past performances. Welcome to the Luxmore Theater, where the curtain never truly falls, and the audience is always watching. My name is Jonas Fell, a detective chasing a missing person. But I found myself trapped in a production where the script was written in shadows. I was given 3 strange rules just to stay alive. What's the creepiest theater or performance space you've ever been in? Tell me in the comments below. And if you're brave enough to take a seat in the Luxmore After Dark, subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules and ring that bell. Because here, the drama isn't just on stage, it's everywhere. The show is about to begin. I've learned that some crime scenes whisper to you, residues of violence and despair clinging to the air like stale perfume. But the Luxmore Theater, it positively sings a siren song of madness, a tune I still hear in the dead of night, when the city outside finally holds its breath. They hired me, Jonas Fell, private investigator, ex-CSU, to find Elise Morano, the opera diva whose voice could shatter glass and mend hearts. After she vanished mid-area, a wisp of silk and scandal, her disappearance had an unnerving resonance, an echo of a case from my uniform days. Another performer, another stage, another silence that screamed louder than any evidence I'd ever bagged. That old ghost still gnawed at my sanity. The Luxmore's current manager, a nervous, perpetually sweating man named Alistair Finch, whose main qualification seemed to be inheriting the damned place, handed me a heavy brass key ring. And she was right there, Mr. Fell, he stammered, his jowls trembling, singing Quando me vo, then poof, like a stage trick, but without the applause. He avoided my eyes, instead gesturing towards the cavernous velvet-draped gloom of the auditorium. The staff, they say the place is particular, has its moods. He then pressed a folded yellowed piece of paper into my hand. Found this in the old maestro's dressing room. Been there for decades, they say. Figured, well, better you see it. 3 rules, scrawled in an elegant but increasingly frantic hand. Carry a flashlight, but never shine it on the back balcony rows. The shadows there prefer their solitude. If you hear violin sounds of unknown origin, wear a metal ring from the prop room. Music has its own language here, and not all of it is an invitation. When you find scripts with your name, don't read the part. Some roles are best left unplayed. I almost snorted. Theatrical superstition. But Finch's palpable terror, the way his gaze kept darting towards the upper tiers of the theater, gave me pause. My predecessor on this case, a bright-eyed kid named Miller, fresh out of high school, had apparently dismissed such warnings as local color. They'd found his meticulously organized notebook on an empty seat in the orchestra pit, his observations on Elise's habits slowly devolving over the last few pages into a rambling, incoherent dialogue with a character named the Scrivener. A character from no known play. Miller himself was gone. My initial walkthrough was an exercise in oppressive grandeur. Dust motes danced like spectral ballerinas in the few shafts of light, piercing the gloom. The air was thick with the scent of decaying velvet, old wood, and something else. A faint, almost imperceptible tang of old ink, and something vaguely floral, like lilies left too long in stagnant water. Elise's signature perfume, perhaps, or a more permanent olfactory resident. In the wings, I met Noah Grange. He was young, mid-20s, with an almost preternatural quietness about him as he meticulously organized costumes on a rolling rack. His movements were precise, economical, polite, almost deferential. He offered what little information he had. Elise was a consummate professional, a demanding talent, but always kind to the crew. He wore noise-canceling headphones almost constantly, he explained, to focus on his delicate repair work amidst the general chaos of production. His eyes, though, dark and intelligent, seemed to miss nothing, cataloging me with a cool, detached curiosity. Adhere's dressing room was a shrine of opulent disarray. Gowns spilled from wardrobes, scores lay open on a grand piano. A half-finished glass of champagne sat beside a wilting rose. It looked as if she'd just stepped out for a moment, but on her antique vanity, amidst the silver-backed brushes and crystal perfume atomizers, I found her signature silk scarf, draped over a small, leather-bound libretto. It bore a peculiar stain near one corner. Not blood, not makeup. It was dark, almost black. And when I touched it, it flaked slightly, like old, dried ink from a stage manuscript, smeared as if someone had clutched it in a moment of, what? Fear? Revelation? The scent of lilies was strongest here, almost cloying. The Luxemore was a labyrinth. Day sped into nights as I mapped its forgotten corners. The cavernous stage with its complex rigging vanishing into the fly space like the skeletal remains of some colossal beast. The rabbit warren of dressing rooms, each with its own faded rooms, each with its own faded memories. The prop rooms, crammed with the detritus of 1,000 imagined worlds. Swords that had drawn no blood, chalices that had held no poison, crowns that had adorned no royal brow. The silence was the most unnerving part. It wasn't empty. It was pregnant. I held breath, waiting for a cue that never came. One evening, I found myself alone on the vast darkened stage, the faint glow of the single ghost light casting long, distorted shadows. A faint sound, a creak of old wood, a whisper of disturbed dust, drew my attention upwards, towards the deep, velvety darkness of the rear balcony rows. I instinctively raised my heavy maglite, its beam ready to cut through the gloom. Rule number 1. Carry a flashlight, but never shine it on the back balcony rows. The shadows there prefer their solitude. My thumb hovered over the switch. A sudden, inexplicable chill swept across the stage, raising gooseflesh on my arms despite the stuffy air. It wasn't just cold. It was a profound, bone-deep iciness, accompanied by an almost physical pressure, as if the darkness in those upper tiers was coalescing. Looking back, I lowered the flashlight, a prickle of unease, illogical but potent, crawling up my spine. The feeling slowly receded, leaving behind only the scent of dust and decay, and a faint, lingering trace of lilies. My investigation led me to the Havenwood Sanatorium, a Gothic pile on the outskirts of Salem, where Renee Thorne, the Luxmore's former principal librettist, now resided. Her lucidity, I was warned, was a flickering candle in a high wind. I found her in a sun-dappled solarium, her fingers tracing invisible words on the polished surface of a table. "The script," she murmured, her eyes, the color of faded forget-me-nots, focusing on me with startling intensity. "It keeps changing." Elise knew. She tried to rewrite his ending. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "The balcony man. He doesn't like new words. He only likes his own silence." She clutched my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Your name, detective. If you find your name in one of his revisions, don't read your lines. That's when the performance truly begins." Her gaze drifted, the light fading from her eyes, and she began to hum a tuneless, mournful air. Back at the Luxmore, sifting through a box of water-damaged archives Finch had unearthed from a sub-basement, I found them. Several loose, typewritten pages, brittle with age, tucked inside a moldering program for a 1940s production of an opera I'd never heard of. Requiem for Silence. The pages detailed a scene between a tormented composer and a spectral muse. Several lines of dialogue were heavily crossed out, and new lines, written in a spidery, archaic hand, were inserted in the margins. The ink was a faded, brownish black, identical to the smear on Elise Morano's scarf. The new line spoke of an eternal performance, a stage that demanded endless encores. The deeper I delved, the more the Luxmore seemed to resist, its secrets clinging to the shadows like cobwebs. I interviewed the remaining skeleton crew, a couple of ancient stagehands who spoke in hushed tones of the old days, and the maestro's lingering presence, and Noah Grange, always polite, always observant from behind his headphones, offering meticulously catalogued inventories of props and costumes, but little else of substance regarding Elise's habits or state of mind. He seemed to exist in a pocket of calm, amidst the theater's decaying grandeur, a quiet node in its network of unease. One late afternoon, while searching the vast subterranean prop storage, a catacomb of forgotten fantasies, smelling of dust, mildew, and something faintly, unsettlingly sweet like old stage makeup, I heard it. A violin, rich, melancholic, impossibly beautiful, the notes seeming to weep from the very stones of the foundation. It was a melody I didn't recognize, yet it felt achingly familiar, a lament for lost things. There were no musicians scheduled, no rehearsals. The sound was sourceless, ethereal. Rule number 2. If you hear violin sounds of unknown origin, wear a metal ring from the prop room. Renee Thorne's fragmented warnings. The old stage manager's unease. I was beginning to think there was more to these theatrical superstitions than I'd initially credited. I rummaged through a dusty crate labeled Tragic Loves, jewelry, and found a collection of tarnished rings. I chose a plain, heavy band of what looked like pewter or dull silver, its surface cool against my skin as I slipped it onto my little finger. As the metal settled, the violin's melody seemed to shift. The heartbreaking beauty remained, but a certain insidious beckoning quality and almost hypnotic pull it had possessed moments before subtly receded. It was still playing, but it felt less like an invitation and more like a distant, sorrowful echo. I followed the sound through a maze of hanging backdrops painted with ghostly landscapes, and into a deeper, damper section of the basement I hadn't realized existed. There, in a small, brick-lined alcove, lit by a single bare bulb, sat Declan Marsh. He was ancient, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes milky and sightless. A battered violin rested under his chin, his gnarled fingers coaxing that mournful sound from its time-worn wood. "You heard her then, detective?" he rasped, without turning, his bow never faltering. "The Lady of Lost Arias. She plays when a new performer is about to take the stage." He finally lowered the violin. "That ring will dull her voice for a time, but she's persistent." He tapped a finger against the side of his violin. "This instrument has 4 good strings. Sometimes, though, a man might fancy he hears a 5th, an impossible note. That's when you know the curtain's truly rising on something not meant for mortal eyes. If you hear that 5th string, detective, destroy the nearest instrument. Any instrument. Break the song. Whoa, break the song." He nodded towards a dusty cello case leaning in the corner. As I was leaving, I nearly collided with Lana Dovell. She was a theater student. An intern Finch had recently brought on to help organize the Luxmore chaotic archives. A task she attacked with a bright, modern enthusiasm that felt jarringly out of place in the decaying theater. "Find anything interesting, Mr. Fell?" she asked, her eyes alight with curiosity. "This place is a gold mine of forgotten scripts. I found a whole stack earlier, near the orchestra pit. No author credited, but the dialogue, it's intense, almost like they were written yesterday." She held up a sheaf of freshly printed pages, bound with a simple brass clip. "There's even a character in this one, a detective, investigating a disappearance in an old theater." A small, knowing smile played on her lips. Lana's discovery of the uncredited scripts added another layer of unease to my investigation. She was captivated by them, by the raw, contemporary feel of the dialogue juxtaposed with the Luxmore's gothic atmosphere. One afternoon, while I was examining some of Elise Morano's personal correspondence in the small, dusty office Finch had given me, Lana burst in, her usual ebullience tinged with a strange excitement. "Mr. Fell, you have to hear this," she exclaimed, waving a few pages from the mysterious new scripts. "It's a scene with the character, Serafina. Her lines, they're almost exactly what the papers reported. Elise Morano saying in her last interview about feeling trapped by her own legend, about wanting to sing a new song before the old one consumed her. It's uncanny." Before I could stop her, swept up in her own theatrical fervor, Lana began to read Serafina's monologue aloud. Her voice, usually light and clear, took on a richer, more resonant timbre, a subtle vibrato that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just good acting. It was as if another persona, older, more world-weary, was bleeding through. Her eyes, normally bright and direct, became unfocused, gazing at some point beyond the grimy office walls. She finished the monologue, a single, perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Wow," she breathed, shaking her head as if to clear it. "That was intense. I really felt that. I think I need some air, or maybe a specific prop." There was a silver hand mirror mentioned in scene 3. She trailed off, a vague, distant look in her eyes, and wandered out of the office, not towards the exit, but deeper into the labyrinthine backstage area. I called after her, but she didn't respond. A sudden, cold dread gripped me. I grabbed the pages she'd left on my desk. It was from a play titled simply Intermission. I scanned the character list. Serafina, the stage manager, the critic, and then my blood turned to ice. Jonas, a private investigator haunted by his past, seeking a truth that may consume him. My hands trembled as I read the first few lines of Jonas's dialogue. They described his arrival at a cursed theater, his initial skepticism, his discovery of a stained silk scarf. It was a mirror, a terrifyingly accurate reflection of my own actions, my own unspoken thoughts over the past few days. Rule number 3, when you find scripts with your name, don't read the part. I'd read my part, or at least the beginning of it. I raced out, searching for Lana. The backstage area was a confusing warren of narrow corridors, stacked flats painted with faded pastoral scenes, and alcoves filled with spectral, dust-sheeted furniture. She was gone, vanished as completely as Elise Morano. Her cheerful, modern backpack sat abandoned on a costume hamper, a single, freshly printed page from Intermission lying beside it, detailing Serafina's quiet exit, seeking solace in the reflection she no longer recognized. My gaze fell on Noah Grange. He was calmly polishing a brass doorknob on a nearby dressing room, his headphones, as always, in place. He looked up as I approached, his expression one of mild, polite inquiry. "Lana Dovell," I said, my voice tight. "Have you seen her?" He removed his headphones slowly, a faint, almost inaudible snatch of synthesized music escaping before he cupped them. "Miss Dovell." "I believe I saw her heading towards the grand mirror room a short while ago, Mr. Fell." She seemed rather preoccupied, said something about needing to find her true face for the role. His eyes, dark and unblinking, held mine. There was no guile in them, no malice, only a profound, chilling emptiness, like looking into a perfectly polished, vacant stage. A new note was pinned to the Luxmore's old cork callboard, a board usually reserved for rehearsal schedules and union notices. It was a single sheet of the same freshly printed script paper. At the top, in stark, bold letters, Act 2, Scene 1. Jonas, Int. Grand Mirror Room, Night. Below it, the first line of dialogue, attributed to my character, was a question I hadn't yet asked, but one that was now screaming in my own mind. What kind of performance are you truly staging here, Grange? The Grand Mirror Room. I vaguely remembered Finch mentioning it. a relic from the Luxmore's more opulent vaudeville days, now mostly used for storage, or so had claimed. Its name, coupled with Lana's strange talk of finding her true face, and the chillingly prescient script page, sent a fresh wave of dread through me. Noah Grange's impassive gaze followed me as I turned towards the corridor he'd indicated, his silence more damning than any confession. The air grew colder, the familiar scent of dust and lilies now overlaid with a faint, sharp odor, like ozone before a lightning strike, or the static charge from an old television screen. The passage to the mirror room was long and lined with faded portraits of forgotten stars, their painted smiles like mocking rictuses in the dim emergency lighting. The room itself was vast, circular, and utterly disorienting. Every inch of wall space from floor to ceiling was covered in mirrors of all shapes and sizes. Antique, beveled ovals, stark, modern squares, chipped, gilded rococo frames. My own reflection multiplied infinitely. 100 fractured Jonas fells staring back with my own growing apprehension. Dust lay thick on the floor, disturbed only by a single set of small, hesitant footprints leading towards the center of the room. Lana's. There was no sign of her. Only the silent, watching eyes of my own endless reflections. And then I felt it, that same oppressive, bone-chilling cold I'd experienced on the stage, the one that had warned me away from the rear balcony. It was emanating not from any single mirror, but from the collective gaze of the room, as if every reflection held a fragment of some watching, waiting consciousness. My flashlight. I needed to see, but the first rule, never shine it on the back balcony rows. This wasn't the balcony, but the principle felt terrifyingly similar. The Luxmore played by its own twisted stage directions. Instead, I remembered an old evidence-gathering trick. I pulled out my phone, activated the camera, and holding it low, angled it upwards and sideways, using the screen as an indirect viewing jod. The phone screen flickered. For a moment, all I saw were more distorted reflections of myself and the room. Then in the upper curve of a large tarnished oval mirror, a shape resolved. Indistinct at first, then coalescing. A tall, slender figure in what looked like the severe, black frock coat and high collar of a 19th century maestro or a tragic poet. Its face was a pale blur in the gloom, but its posture was one of intense, sorrowful concentration, as if perpetually listening for a lost note. The balcony man, he wasn't in the mirror. The mirror was merely a window to him, a window to that forbidden upper darkness. As his image solidified on my phone screen, a wave of profound disorientation washed over me. My own name, Jonas Fell, felt suddenly distant, like a character I'd once read about. Instead, thoughts, emotions, fragments of a different life flooded my mind. A desperate composer, a lost love, an unfinished symphony, a looming deadline, the protagonist of Requiem for Silence. My hand, the one holding the phone, began to tremble. I fought to clear my head, to anchor myself. Jonas Fell, private investigator, Elise Morano, Lana Dovel. The names were anchors in a sea of encroaching fiction. A faint sound, a single, drawn-out violin note, vibrated through the floorboards. It was achingly beautiful, but threaded through it was another, discordant tone, a fifth string, an impossible, grating resonance that scraped at my sanity. Declan Marsh's warning, destroy the nearest instrument. My eyes darted around the room. Leaning against a stack of hat boxes, almost hidden in shadow, was a battered cello case. I lunged for it, fumbled with the latches. It was empty. Of course it was. The music wasn't coming from an instrument in this room. It was coming from the theater itself, from its damned, haunted soul. A compelling performance, detective. You play the part of the tormented investigator, quite convincingly. Noah Grange's voice, calm and cool, cut through the disorienting haze. He stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, his headphones now resting around his neck. That faint, synthesized music I'd heard before was audible now. A minimalist, unsettling electronic score, like something from an avant-garde film. "Where's Lana Grange?" I snarled, forcing my own identity, My own case, back to the forefront of my mind. The balcony man's influence receded slightly, like a tide pulling back, though the cold pressure remained. He smiled, a slight, almost imperceptible upturn of his lips. Miss Dovell. She found her role, as did Elise Morano before her, as did young Mr. Miller. They all read their parts, you see, and the luck's more. It's a very accommodating stage. It always provides an audience. He gestured vaguely around the mirrored room, and it offers such a wide array of exits. You did this, I said, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The scripts, the subtle manipulations, the knowledge of the theater's peculiarities. You're the one changing the scripts, aren't you? You're the scrivener. A quaint title, Noah mused, but not entirely inaccurate. I merely facilitate. The balcony man provides the inspiration, the underlying libretto of this place. I simply update it, give it a contemporary resonance. Elise, bless her ambitious heart, thought she could rewrite his masterwork. She underestimated the power of an established narrative. He took a step into the room, his reflection multiplying around us. She tried to silence him. But silence, in the Luxmore, is just an intermission before the next act. Why, Grange? Why me? The question from the script page, my question. His eyes, for the first time, held a flicker of something other than detached amusement. A cold, hard gleam. You, Detective Fell, are a connoisseur of stages like this, are you not? The one in Boston, 5 years ago. The one where the lead actress took her final bow with a prop knife that wasn't quite a prop. A case you never quite closed. A performance that left lingering questions. My blood ran cold. He knew. He knew about the Ashton Theater. About Amelia Hayes, a secret I'd buried deep. Her understudy was a very promising young talent. Noah continued, his voice soft, almost sympathetic, yet underscored with a chilling satisfaction. She never quite recovered from the accident, never stepped on the stage again. He paused. I don't believe in ghosts, Mr. Fell, or curses. I believe in patterns, in meticulously crafted scenarios. I believe that if you isolate an individual, apply the right pressures, introduce the right script, they will inevitably play their part, right down to the tragic finale. The synthesized music from his headphones swelled subtly. The temperature in the grand mirror room plummeted further. The image of the balcony man in the oval mirror seemed to lean forward, its featureless face turned directly towards me. The script wasn't just predicting my actions, it was directing them, with Noah as its conductor, and the theater's own malevolent sentience as the orchestra. The very walls, lined with their silent, watching reflections, felt like the closing jaws of a trap. And I, Jonas Fell, was the lead in a play whose final act I was desperate not to perform. Noah Grange's confession hung in the frigid air of the grand mirror room, a chilling testament to a meticulously crafted, years-long revenge. He saw the Luxmore not as haunted, but as a perfect psychological crucible, and its rules as exploitable stage directions for his twisted productions. The balcony man was merely a legend he could weave into his narratives, a phantom to enhance the atmosphere. You're insane, Grange, I said, my voice tight, fighting the tendrils of the balcony man's influence that still sought purchase in my mind, trying to pull me back into the role of the tormented composer. I had to stay Jonas Fell, the detective. Noah just smiled, that same cold, knowing smile. Insanity is relative, detective. Is it more insane to believe in ghosts or to understand the precise mechanics of human desperation when placed under unbearable pressure? I prefer the latter. The latter, it's so much more predictable. The synthesized music from his headphones pulsed, a low, throbbing beat that seemed to synchronize with the oppressive atmosphere. I needed to break his script, to improvise. The rules themselves, twisted as they were by the theater's unseen forces and Grange manipulations, might hold a clue. The flashlight, the ring, the scripts. Lana, I said, forcing my thoughts away from Noah's psychological game. Where is she? And Elise Morano. Are they just gone? Written out of your play? Miss Deville found her part. As a cautionary tale, perhaps, Noah said, gesturing vaguely towards the labyrinth of mirrors. And Miss Morano. She tried to change the ending of Requiem for Silence. The balcony man does not appreciate unauthorized revisions. She's part of his permanent ensemble now, I imagine. An eternity of encores in the dark. His callousness was a spur. I had to find a weakness, not just in him, but in the theater's hold. The balcony man, whether ghost or mass delusion amplified by Grange, was tied to Requiem for Silence. Renee Thorne had said Elise was trying to rewrite his ending. The script, Noah. I pressed. An idea forming. A desperate gamble. The one you're so fond of. What if the lead actor refuses his lines? What if he introduces a new character? One you didn't write? A flicker of something. Surprise. Annoyance? Crossed Noah's face. The script is comprehensive, detective. All contingencies are accounted for, but his confidence seemed, for the first time, a fraction less absolute. I remembered Declan Marsh's words. If you hear that fifth string, destroy the nearest instrument, break the song, the script, the performance. They were all intertwined. My eyes scanned the room again. No instruments here, but the mirrors. They were the theater's eyes. Its reflecting soul, the very things amplifying the balcony man's presence. And Noah, with his synthesized soundscape, was creating his own music. I took a step towards him. Your little production ends tonight, Grange. He tensed, his hand subtly moving towards something in his pocket. A small remote, perhaps, for his sound system. My gaze locked onto the largest, most ornate mirror in the room. The one where the balcony man's image seemed most potent. It was an antique, its gilded frame heavy and elaborate. I grabbed a fallen candelabra from a dusty side table. Solid brass, heavy. Every play needs a climax, Grange, I said, my voice louder now, projecting like an actor on a stage. And sometimes, the set itself needs to come crashing down. Before he could react, I swung the candelabra with all my strength. It connected with the great mirror with a sound like a shattering thunderclap. The glass exploded inwards, a shower of silvered shards cascading onto the dusty floor. The effect was instantaneous and violent, a piercing, inhuman shriek, like 1,000 out-of-tune violins, tore through the room. Not from Noah, but from the very air around us. The oppressive cold intensified for a horrifying moment, then seemed shatter like the mirror. The image of the balcony man, which had been so potent, flickered and dissolved into a swirl of agitated shadows, then vanished. The synthesized music from Noah's headphones cut out abruptly, replaced by a harsh, grating static. Noah cried out, not in pain, but in outrage and disbelief, stumbling back as if struck. No, the resonance, the focal point. You've broken the narrative frame. Consider it an edit, I snarled, advancing on him. The fight, when it came, was brief and brutal. Noah was fueled by a fanatic's rage, but he was no fighter. I was driven by a desperate need to reclaim my own story. I disarmed him of a small, wickedly sharp prop knife he'd pulled from his jacket. The Luxmore, it seemed, always provided. As I subdued him, cuffing his hands behind his back with a pair of zip ties I always carried, I heard a faint sound from behind a particularly large freestanding triptych mirror that had, until now, seemed like just another part of the wall. A soft whimpering. Lana. She was huddled in a hidden alcove behind the mirror, pale and disoriented, but alive. Mr. Fell? She whispered, her eyes wide with a residual terror. The man in black. He kept showing me pages, my name, I didn't want to say the words. "It's okay, Lana," I said, helping her up. "The understudy is stepping down. As for Elise Morano, we found her later in a sealed-off section of the sub-basement, a place Declan Marsh had never dared to explore. She was alive, barely, clutching a tattered handwritten score of Requiem for Silence, her lips moving silently, as if singing an aria only she could hear. She had indeed tried to rewrite the ending, and in doing so, had become trapped within its oldest verses. Noah Grange's carefully constructed world crumbled with the shattering of the grand mirror. Without its focal point, the balcony man's influence seemed to dissipate, receding into the deep shadows of the Luxmore, a wounded echo rather than an active presence. Grange himself, when the police finally arrived, alerted by a now functioning emergency call I'd made from Finch's office, was a rambling, incoherent mess, his meticulous plans reduced to the ravings of a madman. He spoke of narrative integrity and character arcs, but the officers just saw a dangerous obsessive who'd kidnapped 2 women and assaulted a private investigator. They never found the scripts he raved about. They seemed to have vanished like stage smoke. Lana Duvel recovered, though she swore off theater for life, opting for a degree in library sciences instead. She said she could still sometimes feel the phantom weight of unread lines trying to form on her lips. Elise Morano was a different story. She was gently coaxed back to a semblance of reality, but her glorious voice was gone, replaced by a fragile whisper. She would spend her days in a quiet conservatory, sometimes humming fragments of forgotten arias, her eyes fixed on a distant, unseen stage. She never spoke of the Luxmore again. Renee Thorne, when I visited her one last time, seemed calmer, the storm in her eyes having subsided. The silence. "It's a gentler kind now, detective," she said, offering me a small, sad smile. "The balcony man. He's waiting for a new librettist, I suppose. But his favorite mirror is broken. It will take time." Declan Marsh continued to play his violin in the Luxmore's basement, which was now thoroughly sealed by order of the city. He claimed the 5th string was silent, and the Lady of Lost Arias played only her own sorrowful tunes, no longer seeking new performers. As for me, Jonas Fell, I closed the case. Or rather, a version of it the authorities could understand. The Luxmore Theater was condemned, its velvet ropes barring entry forever. Its secrets, both human and otherwise, entombed within its decaying walls. My own ghosts, the ones from the Ashton Theater, felt quieter. Quieter, facing down Noah Grange, breaking his twisted script, had, in some strange way, rewritten a small part of my own internal narrative. But the Luxmore left its mark. A few months later, I was working a mundane insurance fraud case. A welcome change of pace. I was in a dusty antique shop, looking for a particular ledger. My hand brushed against a small, leather-bound book, tucked away on a bottom shelf. It was a collection of obscure one-act plays from the early 20th century. Curious, I opened it. The first play was titled The Shadowbox Reflections. The character list was short. The skeptic, the believer, the observer. As I read the opening stage directions, a circular room, lined with mirrors. Dust motes dance in the single shaft of light. An oppressive silence reigns. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, prickled my skin. Then my eyes fell on the playwright's name, printed in small italics beneath the title. A name I never encountered before in any theatrical anthology. N. Grange, not Noah. Just N. Grange. An ancestor, perhaps. Or was it merely coincidence? I closed the book quickly, a sudden irrational fear gripping me. The script was out there, not just in the Luxmore. The desire to control, to script the lives of others, wasn't unique to one disturbed young man. It was an older story, a more insidious performance. I left the antique shop, the unopened book still on the shelf. Some stories, I realized, are best left unread. Some curtains are best left drawn. The show might be over at the Luxmore, but the hunger for a captive audience, for a perfectly executed final act, that was a drama as old as time itself, always waiting for a new stage, a new set of players, and a new unsuspecting lead. And sometimes, even a broken mirror can still cast a very long shadow. Some families hide secrets, others live inside them. Welcome to the Myro Plantation, a place deep in the Louisiana bayou, where the air is thick with more than just humidity. My name is Marla Quinn, and I came here seeking a quiet escape, a temporary haven. Instead, I found myself living by 3 strange rules, just to stay alive for a family with a chilling legacy. What's the creepiest house you've ever been inside? Tell me in the comments below. And if you're brave enough to step onto the veranda, subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules and ring that bell. Because here, the past isn't buried, it's drawing. Let's meet the children. They say grief can make a house sick, its sorrow seeping into the very timbers. But the Myro Plantation, nestled deep in the humid embrace of the Louisiana bayou, wasn't just sick. It felt like it was actively trying to de-guest its inhabitants, starting with me. I had taken the babysitting job for the twins, Asher and Agnes, as a desperate measure, a way to anchor myself after the recent silent implosion of my own life, the loss I couldn't speak of. I'd imagined the quiet drone of cicadas and the heavy scent of magnolias would be a temporary balm, a distraction from the hollowness within. But Mrs. Paranoir, the family's housekeeper, a woman whose posture was as unyielding as the ancient, moss-draped oaks surrounding the estate, had handed me a list of 3 rules along with the keys. Her voice, as dry and rustling as last year's Spanish moss, implied these weren't suggestions, but articles of survival. For your tenure, Miss Quinn, she'd said, her dark eyes holding no warmth, only a weary resignation. The house itself, a decaying antebellum beauty with wide verandas and shuttered windows like sleepy eyes, seemed to sigh with secrets, its floorboards groaning under unseen weight, even when the air hung still and heavy. The last girl who tried this job, a distant cousin named Callie that I'd mentioned in passing, had apparently found the rule about the muddy footprints too. A mud sing. She'd quit without notice, though some of the sparse local whispers implied she never truly left the swamp's cloying embrace. My name is Marla Quinn, student of psychology, temporary nanny, and current custodian of a grief so profound it felt like a phantom limb. The drive to the Myro estate had been an unnerving descent into a world that time seemed to have forgotten. The paved road giving way to gravel, then to a rutted dirt track swallowed by encroaching cypress and tupelo. The air, when I finally stepped out of my sputtering car, was thick enough to drink, laden with the perfume of unseen blossoms, the decay of the swamp, and something primal and watchful. Mr. Amos Myro met me on the veranda. He was a tall man, gaunt and stoop-shouldered, his eyes holding the weary shadows of sleepless nights and unspoken sorrows. He looked like a man slowly being consumed by his own legacy. "Miss Quinn," he said, his voice a low rumble, barely audible above the chorus of unseen insects. "Thank you for coming. The children, they require a certain understanding." He didn't elaborate, instead handing me that same list of rules Mrs. Paranoir had shown me, now neatly typed on aged, water-stained cardstock. When the children call you by their dead sister's name, don't correct them. If the twins insist their grandmom is visiting, serve her sweet tea, even though she died in 1890. When muddy footprints lead up the wall to the ceiling, something came back from the swamp. "Traditions, Miss Quinn," he'd explained, his gaze fixed on some distant point over my shoulder. "Keeps the house settled, keeps the children calm." His explanation felt as thin and brittle as old lace. The twins, Asher and Agnes, were 7. Agnes were 7. Airily beautiful children with identical mops of dark curly hair and eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the light. They possessed a quiet, unnerving intelligence and an almost telepathic ability to finish each other's sentences. From another wing of the sprawling, shadowed house, I'd caught a glimpse of Callie Myro. She was perhaps 19, with a pale, watchful face and an air of sullen detachment. She'd observed me with an unnerving, silent intensity before melting back into the gloom. My first direct encounter with the children set the tone. As I knelt to introduce myself, Agnes, her dark eyes unnervingly direct, offered a small, knowing smile. "Hello, Sister Rose," she said, her voice a soft, bell-like chime. Asher, standing beside her, simply nodded, his gaze equally intense. "You're back." My heart gave a painful lurch. Rose. The name felt cold on their tongues. A forgotten melody suddenly replayed. The first few days at the Myro plantation were a disorienting blend of cloying southern charm and creeping, insidious dread. Asher and Agnes were a constant, quiet presence, their dark eyes following my every move, and they never, not once, called me Marla. It was always Sister Rose, or just Rose. I tried to adhere to Mr. Myro's first rule, clamping down on the instinct to correct them, to assert my own identity, but with each utterance of that other name, a tiny piece of Marla seemed to fray. "Rose, will you read us the story about the Swamp Princess?" Asher would ask, his voice serious. Rosa always knew how to plait my hair just right. Agnes would add, handing me a brush. They spoke of their dead sister not with sadness, but with a simple, unnerving matter-of-factness, as if she were merely in the next room, or had just stepped out onto the veranda. They described Rose's favorite games, Rose's hiding spots, Rose's fear of thunderstorms, details that often eerily mirrored my own preferences or recent, unspoken anxieties. It was as if they were seeing someone else when they looked at me, or worse, as if they were slowly, subtly, making me into someone else. I learned what I could about Rose Myro. She drowned in the bayou a few years prior. A tragic accident, everyone said. A slippery bank, a moment of childish carelessness, but the whispers I gleaned from Mrs. Perrinois, and from a few hushed, reluctant locals I encountered on my rare trips into the nearest one-street town for supplies, hinted at something darker, something less accidental. "The swamp takes what it wants," one old woman at the general store had muttered, her eyes clouded with an ancient fear, refusing to meet my gaze. Callie Myro remained a peripheral, unsettling presence. She'd appear silently in doorways, her gaze lingering on me with an intensity that felt less like curiosity and more like assessment or accusation. Once, as I was looking through an old, leather-bound photo album I'd found in the dusty parlor, filled with stiff, unsmiling Mayo ancestors, Callie had drifted in. "They say some faces just fit the frame better than others," she'd remarked, her voice flat, before vanishing as silently as she'd come. Her words, like so much else in this house, felt like a veiled threat. The twins' artwork was particularly disturbing. They drew constantly, their small hands working with a focused intensity. Their subject matter was almost exclusively centered around Rose. One afternoon, Asher presented me with a drawing. A stick figure girl with wild dark hair remarkably like my own stood in the center of a crudely drawn circle of what looked like swirling mud. Tiny, bare footprints led away from the girl, but they were printed in reverse, as if someone were walking backwards into her. Beside the girl, a taller, shadowy figure with a benevolent, grandmotherly smile watched. "That's you, Rose," Asher had said, his voice devoid of inflection. "And that's Grandmom Della, waiting." The weight of Rose's invisible presence grew heavier with each passing day. I found myself unconsciously humming tunes I didn't know, snippets of lullabies that felt both alien and deeply familiar. My own reflection in the tarnished mirrors of the old house sometimes seemed off. The angle of my smile, the look in my eyes, subtly not my own. The Louisiana heat was a constant, oppressive blanket. Yet I often felt a deep internal chill. One sweltering afternoon, as thunder rumbled ominously in the distance, a precursor to one of the bayou's sudden, violent storms, the twins approached me with a grave formality. "Nachi, Grandmom Della is coming to visit Rose," Agnes announced, her small face serious. Asher nodded. She always comes before a big rain, and she'll be wanting her sweet tea. Rule number 2. If the twins insist their grandmom is visiting, serve her sweet tea, even though she died in 1890. My rational mind, the student of psychology, screamed that this was a child's fantasy, a coping mechanism perhaps, but the unwavering conviction in their eyes, the oppressive atmosphere of the house, the memory of that strange drawing. I found myself walking towards the kitchen. Mr. Moreau, I had noticed, always kept a specific antique silver tea service and a particular blend of black tea leaves on a small lace-covered table in the dim hallway leading to the formal parlor. He'd never mentioned it, but its constant ritualistic presence felt significant. I brewed the tea, sweetening it heavily with cane sugar. Just as Louisiana tradition dictated, my hands trembled slightly as I arranged a single delicate china cup and saucer on the silver tray. The twins watched me, their expressions unreadable. I carried the tray to that little table in the hallway, the air around it noticeably cooler, tinged with the faint, almost imperceptible scent of dried lavender, and something else, something like old, cherished books. I left it there, as per the unspoken expectation. An hour later, as the storm raged outside, lashing the ancient oaks and rattling the window panes, I forced myself to walk back down that hallway. The house was filled with the roar of the wind and rain, yet the area around the tea table seemed uncannily still. The teacup, which I was certain I'd filled to a polite 3/4, was now only half full, and there, on the delicate porcelain rim, was the faint, unmistakable imprint of lipstick. A deep, antique rose color, a color no living woman in this house wore. The scent of lavender was stronger now, a ghostly perfume lingering in the still air. That night, driven by a desperate need for answers, I crept into Mr. Myro's study. It was filled with ledgers, engineering diagrams for levees and canals, and stacks of local historical society pamphlets. Tucked away in a locked drawer he'd once carelessly left ajar, I found it. A slim, vellum-bound diary, its pages brittle, the ink faded. It was Della Myro. The entries were sparse, filled with references to the old ways, the whispers from the water, and a returner who seeks a new reflection. One passage, dated shortly before her death in 1890, chilled me to the core. The pact requires a gentle hand and a willing vessel. The tea soothes, the name invites. Rose is a strong name. It will serve again. As I closed the diary, a floorboard creaked upstairs. Agnes' soft voice drifted down the stairwell, clear in the sudden lull of the storm. Rose isn't supposed to read Grandmom's secrets, she said, not to me, but as if to someone standing beside her. Grandmom doesn't like it when Rose forgets whose eyes should see what. The days after the storm were heavy with an unspoken anticipation. The air in the Mayo house felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. The twins were quieter, more watchful, their games infused with a new, unsettling solemnity. They'd whisper to each other in a language I couldn't quite catch, their dark eyes flicking towards me, then away, as if sharing a secret I wasn't yet privy to. My dreams were a maelstrom of murky water, grasping hands, and a faceless woman humming a lullaby in a voice that was both mine and not mine. The Rose persona was no longer just a name the children called me. It was becoming a suffocating second skin. The headache started then. Dull, throbbing pressures behind my eyes, often accompanied by a faint scent of swamp mud and decay. Even when the windows were closed and the air conditioning hummed, my own recent loss, the secret grief I carried, felt raw and exposed. And a strange, dangerous thought began to take root. Perhaps being Rose, even a borrowed, haunted version of her, was a way to fill the emptiness, to nurture something, even if it wasn't real. Then came the morning of the footprints. The storm had passed, leaving the bayou steaming under a hot white sun. I walked into the grand, seldom used parlor, its heavy velvet drapes still drawn against the morning light. And I saw them, rule number 3. When muddy footprints lead up the wall to the ceiling, something came back from the swamp, clear as day, a trail of small, perfectly formed, muddy footprints, led from the French doors that opened onto the back veranda. Doors I was certain had been locked, across the polished cypress floor, straight up the damask papered wall, across the polished cypress floor, straight up the damask papered wall, on that plasterwork of the ceiling, and ended abruptly, directly above the very center of the room, above a faded Aubusson rug, where, according to the twins, Rose used to lie and look for faces in the water stains. The mud was dark, viscous, and reeked of the deep swamp, a cloying miasma of decay, stagnant water, and something else, something metallic and faintly reptilian. Small, almost imperceptible droplets of muddy water dripped from the ceiling onto the rug below, each one landing with a soft, sickening plop. The air around the footprints was unnaturally cold and damp, a pocket of bayou night anachronistically present in the sunlit morning. I backed away slowly, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't a child's prank. This wasn't imagination. This was tangible, terrifying proof that the rules were not mere superstitions, but literal warnings. I confronted Mr. Myro, my voice shaking despite my efforts to remain calm. He listened, his face impassive, his eyes distant. "The old house settles, Miss Quinn," he said, his voice flat. "The swamp, it has a long reach. Some promises once made must be kept, for the sake of the family, for the sake of continuity." His words were a dismissal, a confirmation of some unspoken, horrifying pact. Callie appeared in the doorway then, silent as always, her expression unreadable. But as her gaze followed mine to the muddy tracks ascending the wall, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of recognition, of satisfaction. Later that day, Asher found me staring at the tracks on the ceiling, a knot of ice in my stomach. He tugged on my hand. "Don't worry, Rose," he said, his voice soft. "The returner just wants to make sure you remember where you came from and where you're going." He then handed me a small, crudely made doll of twigs and Spanish moss, his button eyes sewn on with black thread, staring blankly. "This is you, when you're all finished," he explained solemnly. "The returner likes it when the eyes are empty. It makes more room." The house held its breath. The storm that had raged outside had passed, but a more insidious tempest was gathering within the Myro plantation's decaying walls. The muddy footprints on the parlor ceiling were a constant, silent accusation, a visceral reminder that the boundaries between worlds were not just thin here. They were actively being breached. The air was thick with the cloying scent of swamp decay and that unnerving cold dampness that seemed to follow the returner's passage. The twins Asher and Agnes were different. Their usual quiet intensity had sharpened into a feverish, almost trance-like state. They whispered constantly to each other, their dark eyes darting towards me with a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling anticipation. They'd stopped asking me to read or play. Instead, they sat huddled together in the dimmest corner of the nursery, furiously sketching on a large roll of butcher paper Mr. Myro had inexplicably provided. The scratching of their crayons was a rasping, relentless sound. "The returner is coming to finish the picture, Rose," Agnes would murmur, not looking up from her work. "It needs your face to be just right," Asher would add, his small hand moving with an unnerving precision. "So everyone will know you're truly home." My own psychological state was deteriorating. The headaches were near constant, and the lines between Marla and Rose were blurring into a terrifying, indistinct landscape. The grief for my lost child, a pain I had tried so desperately to suppress, was now a raw, open wound, and a perverse, insidious thought whispered in the recesses of my mind. If I became Rose, truly became her, could I care for these children? Could I fill the void in this broken family and in myself The returner's influence, I suspected, wasn't just physical. It was a subtle, insidious psychic invasion, preying on vulnerability, on loss. That evening, as a new, unnatural twilight descended, the sky a bruised, sickly yellow, despite the early hour. The power flickered and died, plunging the house into a suffocating darkness, relieved only by the emergency lanterns I'd frantically lit. The twins didn't flinch. They simply continued their drawing by the wavering candlelight, their faces pale, their eyes like dark pools reflecting the flame. Then Callie appeared. She stepped into the nursery doorway, a shadowy figure against the deeper gloom of the hallway. The cold, aloof mask she usually wore was gone, replaced by an expression of fervent, almost ecstatic zeal. Her eyes glittered in the candlelight with an unnatural intensity. "The time is almost here, Rose," she said, her voice a low, sibilant hiss that sent shivers down my spine. The way she emphasized the name, no longer a childish misnomer, but a deliberate, knowing pronouncement, was terrifying. "Callie, what's going on?" I demanded, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. "What is this, returner?" She laughed, a dry, rasping sound that held no humor. "Ignorant, just like all the others they brought here." She took a step into the room, her shadow looming large and distorted on the wall. "The returner is the lifeblood of this place, of this family. It is the ancient pact that keeps the Myro line from fading, like so many others whose names are now just whispers in the swamp." "Pact? What are you talking about?" I clutched the heavy iron poker from the nursery fireplace, a useless gesture against the encroaching dread. "Rose was meant to be its vessel years ago," Callie continued, her gaze fixed on the twins' drawing, a perfect, willing reflection. But something went awry. The swamp was too greedy that day. Or perhaps Rose wasn't truly Myro enough? A flicker of something. Contempt? Jealousy? Crossed her face, my grandmother. Her great aunt, she tried to correct the balance. She knew the old ways. She knew what the returner required to be soothed, to be anchored. But after her interruption, the house grew restless. The bloodline thinned, her eyes locked onto mine, burning with a chilling conviction. I was the one, you know, the one before you. I understood. I tried to guide the last, offering, but she was weak. She broke the first rule, screamed when they called her by the name that wasn't hers. The returner. It doesn't tolerate such disrespect for the narrative. Her voice dropped. The swamp was untidy that time. The implication, the casual mention of another girl, another life extinguished, hit me with the force of a physical blow. You're in this, I whispered, horrified. You reawakened it? You're sacrificing people? Sacrifice. Callie tilted her head, a beatific, almost beatific smile playing on her lips. No, Miss Quinn. Or should I say, Rose? It's a purification. A strengthening of the bond. The returner needs a vessel that understands its heritage, that will not fight the reflection. It needs true Myro blood, or at least one who will become Myro. You, with your emptiness. You were so very receptive. She gestured towards the twins. They recognized you immediately. The house recognized you. Her words, the way she spoke of my hidden grief, my vulnerability, as a qualification for this horror. It was obscene. But why me? Why force this? Because I am Myro. Her voice rose, cracking with a sudden, raw fury. And I will not let this legacy falter. I initiated the true, older rite. The one Grandmom Della only hinted at in her later years. The one that calls the returner fully, demands its presence, not just its ghostly echoes. It was meant to cleanse, to ensure only the worthy remain to carry the name. It was meant to protect us. Her eyes darted towards the twins, then back to me, a light with a desperate, dangerous fanaticism. But the offering must be willing, or at least completely subsumed. The canvas must be prepared. As she spoke, the temperature in the room plummeted. The scent of swamp mud and decay became overpowering. A low, guttural sighing sound seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the floorboards beneath our feet. The muddy footprints on the ceiling above the parlor, I realized with dawning terror, weren't just tracks. They were anchor points, pathways. The twins stopped drawing. They looked up, their faces pale, their dark eyes fixed on a point just behind me. Agnes held up their finished masterpiece. It was a crude, but terrifyingly detailed portrait. A girl with my dark hair, my features. But her eyes were wide, black, entirely empty pools. Her limbs were entwined with thick, muddy tendrils that seemed to be pulling her down into a swirling vortex of black swamp water. Below the figure, in childish scrawl, was a single word, Rose. "It's almost complete," Callie whispered, her voice filled with a rapturous awe. "The reflection is almost perfect." The house groaned. A section of plaster from the ceiling directly above the twins' drawing cracked and fell, showering them with dust. From the darkness of the hallway, a shape began to coalesce. Taller than a man, vaguely humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its form shifting and unstable, like mud and shadow given a horrifying, temporary life. 2 points of faint, greenish light glowed where its eyes should be. The returner. It had come for its portrait. It had come for Rose. And I was the canvas. The air in the nursery crackled with an unholy energy. The returner, a grotesque silhouette of mud and shadow, pulsed with a cold internal light, its form subtly shifting, its 2 long limbs ending in grasping, tendril-like fingers. The guttural sighing intensified, a sound that seemed to dredge up the oldest, deepest fears from the primal ooze of the bayou. The twins, Asher and Agnes, sat frozen, their dark eyes fixed on the entity, their faces pale masks of fear and a strange, ingrained reverence. Callie, however, was radiant, her face alight with a terrifying, ecstatic triumph. "Behold, Rose!" she cried, her voice ringing with manic fervor, gesturing towards the monstrous apparition. "Your true reflection, the culmination of generations. Embrace it. Become what you were always meant to be." The returner took a slow, ponderous step into the room, its muddy feet leaving no sound on the wooden floor. Yet the very boards seemed to groan under its unseen weight. The stench of decay and stagnant water was overwhelming. It extended a shadowy, tendril-like appendage towards the twins' drawing, towards the crude portrait of Rose being consumed by the swamp. As it did, I felt a horrifying physical pull, as if an invisible cord was tightening around my soul, drawing me towards that painted image, towards that empty-eyed effigy. My own thoughts felt sluggish, overlaid with a cold, alien presence that whispered of surrender, of peace in the deep, dark mud. Rose is home? No. I choked out, the word a ragged tear in the oppressive silence. I fought against the encroaching numbness, the insidious allure of oblivion. My training in psychology, my understanding of suggestion and trauma, it was a fragile shield, but it was all I had. This thing, whatever it was, it fed on identity, on the spaces left by grief and loss. Callie's eyes narrowed. "Don't fight it, you fool. This is your purpose. This is the Maya way." She lunged towards me, perhaps to physically force me closer to the drawing, to the entity. But as she moved, the house itself seemed to rebel against her. Or perhaps the returner's control was not as absolute as she believed. A heavy bookshelf, laden with generations of dusty microhistories, suddenly toppled, crashing to the floor with a sound like thunder, narrowly missing Callie, but blocking her path to me. Books and debris flew everywhere. The distraction was enough. The returner paused, its glowing eyes flickering towards the sound. The psychic pull on me lessened. Just for a moment. I had to break the connection, sever the link between me, the drawing, and that thing. My gaze fell on the twins. They were still staring at their artwork, their small hands clutching each other, their lips moving in some silent, unheard chant. The drawing, it was the focal point, the canvas upon which the returner was painting its new reality. The pact requires a gentle hand and a willing vessel. The tea soothes, the name invites. Rose is a strong name. It will serve again. It will serve again. Delamiro's words echoed in my mind. The name, the image. I stumbled towards the twins, towards their horrific masterpiece. Callie screamed in rage, trying to scramble over the fallen bookshelf. No, don't touch it. You'll ruin the likeness. I ignored her. I grabbed a thick, black crayon that had rolled near my feet. My hands were shaking, my mind a maelstrom of fear and a desperate, nascent resolve. If I was the canvas, then I would change the painting. With a surge of adrenaline, I knelt beside the drawing. The returner let out a low, guttural growl, its shadowy form advancing. I had seconds. Instead of trying to erase the rose figure, I began to draw over it, to alter it. I gave the figure wild, unkempt hair unlike my own, sharp, almost feral features. I drew a jagged scar across one cheek. I changed the clothes from the simple dress the twins had depicted to a pair of rough, patched trousers and a torn shirt. I was transforming Rose into someone else, someone unrecognizable, someone defiant, someone who didn't belong in the Myro narrative. As I drew, the psychic pull lessened further. The figure of the returner seemed to recoil slightly, its form flickering, its glowing eyes dimming with an almost palpable confusion. The whispers in my mind stuttered, faltered. "What are you doing?" Callie shrieked, finally clambering over the debris. "Stop! That's not Rose. That's not the reflection." "Exactly," I gasped, my crayon snapping in two as I finished my crude alterations. I looked at the new image. It was still a girl being consumed by the swamp, but it wasn't me anymore. It wasn't even a recognizable Rose. It was a stranger, an interloper. The returner let out a sound then, a high-pitched, frustrated whine, like air escaping a punctured lung. Its form destabilized, shadows swirling and contracting. The connection, the sympathetic magic of the drawing, had been corrupted, broken. It no longer had a clear image to anchor itself to. No willing vessel prepared in effigy. Callie lunged at me, her face contorted with fury and a dawning terror, as she saw the entity begin to falter. But Mr. Amos Myro suddenly appeared in the nursery doorway, his face a mask of anguish and a terrible newfound resolve. He held an old, heavy shotgun, its twin barrels aimed squarely at Callie. "Enough, Callie," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. This perversion of our name, it ends tonight. The swamp will have its due, but it will not have this innocent." The returner, now a roiling mass of agitated shadow and mud, seemed to turn its baleful, fading gaze from the corrupted drawing towards Callie. Callie, seeing her meticulously planned ritual unraveling, seeing the entity's focus shift, let out a scream of pure, animalistic terror. The very house groaned again, a deep, shuddering sigh of release, or perhaps of a different, older hunger reasserting itself. The muddy footprints on the ceiling above the parlor seemed to drip more insistently, as if weeping black tears. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights, strained official voices, and the cold, sterile reality of the world beyond the bayou's humid embrace. Mr. Amos Myro, his face etched with a grief that seemed centuries old, told the authorities a carefully constructed story. A tragic accident, a disturbed young woman, Callie, who had endangered herself and the children during a severe storm. He never mentioned the returner, the rules, or the name Rose. The muddy footprints, by the time the first responders arrived, had vanished as if they'd never been, leaving only faint water stains on the ceiling, easily dismissed as storm damage. Callie Miro was taken away, her wild, incoherent rants about bloodlines and reflections attributed to a complete psychotic break. I never learned what truly became of her. whether she ended up in an institution or simply disappeared into the labyrinth of the state's overwhelmed system. Sometimes late at night, I'd wonder if the swamp, in its own way, had indeed claimed its due from her. The twins, Asher and Agnes, were placed in the temporary custody of a distant, childless aunt who lived far from the bayou, in a neat suburban house where the loudest sound was the lawnmower next door. They were quiet, withdrawn, and never again mentioned Rose, Grandmom Della, or the returner. The massive drawing I'd made was found, but the central figure was so heavily altered, so scribbled over, that it was indecipherable. Just a dark, angry smudge at the heart of a muddy vortex. I left Louisiana as quickly as I could, the scent of magnolias and swamp decay clinging to me like a shroud. I threw myself back into my psychology studies, trying to dissect what had happened, to categorize it, to file it away under mass hysteria, folie à deux, or localized environmental psychosis. But no academic label could truly encompass the cold dread of the returner's presence, the unnerving certainty of those rules, or the chilling emptiness in Rose's painted eyes. The Miro plantation was eventually abandoned, declared unsafe due to subsidence and the encroaching swamp. Locals whispered that it was slowly being swallowed by the bayou, its secrets returning to the mud. Mr. Miro, they said, simply walked away one day and was never seen again, perhaps seeking his own form of penance in the wider world, or perhaps answering a call only he could hear. Years passed. I finished my degree, became a child psychologist, ironically enough. I dedicated myself to understanding the fragile architecture of young minds, the power of suggestion, the ways in which trauma can reshape reality. I built a life, a career, a semblance of normalcy. I rarely spoke of my time at the Miro estate. It became a locked room in the attic of my memory. Then, about a decade later, I was attending a conference on early childhood development. One of the keynote speakers was a renowned art therapist, known for her work with selectively mute children. Her presentation included several slides of her patients' artwork. As she clicked to one particular image, my blood ran cold. Eyes after Tati, kind of nice on that she. I don't know that is right upside down. It was a child's drawing, rendered in a familiar, crude but intense style. It depicted a tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes, its long limbs ending in tendrils, standing beside a girl with dark, curly hair. The girl was holding a doll. The doll had button eyes, sewn on with black thread, staring blankly. The therapist explained that this particular child, recently adopted from a remote rural parish in Louisiana, had started drawing these images after experiencing a series of vivid nightmares. The child, she said, often whispered a name in her sleep. Rose. I looked closer at the slide, at the signature scrawled in the bottom corner of the drawing. It was a single shaky word, Asher. The returner, or the insidious idea of it, hadn't been entirely erased. It simply found a new canvas, a new generation to whisper its desires to. The portrait was unfinished, the cycle perhaps dormant, but the bayou had a long memory, and its tendrils, I now knew with a chilling certainty, could reach further than anyone imagined. The silence from that locked room in my mind was, once again, beginning to stir. The Miro bloodline runs deep, and its legacy is painted in fear. Marla Quinn learned that some houses don't just have a dark history, they actively consume it. The rules were a desperate guide through a terrifying process of replacement. The returner was thwarted, but the canvas remains unfinished. Seriously, if you didn't stay until the very end, you missed the ultimate twist, the final chilling glimpse of the returner's enduring influence. The last few moments will make you question what truly escaped the bayou. What do you think the returner truly is? What was Callie's ultimate fate? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you made it through the night at the Miro plantation, if the rules haven't broken you, then you're already a part of our story. Subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules, because some family portraits are painted with souls, and the drawing is never truly complete. They say the sea keeps its secrets. This place, it drowns in them. Welcome to the Eves Inn, perched on the jagged Maine coastline. A place where the tide brings in more than just seaweed. My name is Rowan Hart, a detective specializing in the unexplainable. But I found myself investigating disappearances that went deeper than any grave. I was given 3 strange rules just to stay alive. What's the creepiest body of water you've ever been near? Tell me in the comments below. And if you're brave enough to check into the Eves Inn after dark, subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules and ring that bell, because here, the ocean doesn't just roar, it whispers. The investigation begins. I've learned that the sea keeps its secrets deeper than any grave, its vast, indifferent darkness swallowing stories whole. And the Eves Inn, perched on the jagged Maine coastline like a forgotten sentinel, bleached by salt and sorrow, was drowning in them. I'm sausage. They hired me, Rowan Hart, an independent investigator who specialized in the kind of unexplainable cases that made city cops sigh and file, underpinning further evidence that will never arrive. To find out why guests at the inn kept vanishing, a string of disappearances stretching back 5 years, each one a neat, tidy vanishing act, leaving behind only unpaid bills and a lingering chill in the air. This case had the same salt-stenched miasma as the one that had swallowed my partner, Marcus Soule, 3 years prior, up in the misty wilds of coastal Oregon. That particular ghost still walked beside me, his laughter a phantom echo in the roar of the surf. The Eves Inn itself reeked of generations of damp wood, brine, and a peculiar, unsettling silence that even the crashing waves against the cliff face below couldn't fully penetrate. Its windows, salt-caked and dark, were like vacant eyes staring out at the restless gray Atlantic. Mrs. Marta Driggs, the proprietor, a woman whose grief for her own lost husband and daughter clung to her like the ever-present sea mist, greeted me with the weary resignation of someone who had seen too many hopeful faces arrive and too few depart. She didn't offer pleasantries, just a curt nod and a heavy brass room key, followed by an old, water-stained calling card pulled from a drawer behind the dusty reception desk. My husband, Elias. He wrote these down, she said, her voice raspy, like shells grinding on shingle. Just before he went out for his last walk along the cliffs, her gaze flickered towards a colossal oil painting dominating the far wall of the lobby, a turbulent seascape, dark and brooding. He said they were important for anyone who stayed longer than a night. The card, its ink faded but still legible, bore 3 archaic rules. Don't look at the ocean painting in the lobby after 1 a.m. Its tides are not of this world. Leave a silver coin on your pillow each night. It wards off the drowned who seek dry warmth. When you look outside and see a ghost ship anchored in the cove, that's your final voyage. Superstition, I thought, local color. But Marcus had dismissed similar warnings. The last detective on this Eves Inn case, a sharp kid from Portland named Henderson, had supposedly laughed at the silver coin rule. They'd found his room empty, his pillow undisturbed, save for a single, dark, wet handprint, 5-fingered and chillingly human, slowly fading into the pristine linen. My assigned room, overlooking the churning gray expanse of ocean, was cold despite the sputtering radiator. It smelled of salt, mildew, and faintly, disturbingly, of wet wool, like a fisherman's slicker left too long in a damp. As I unpacked, my gaze kept drifting to that painting in the lobby. It was masterfully done, the waves rendered with a furious, almost violent energy. But there was something profoundly unsettling about the way the light seemed to shift on its varnished surface, the way the painted foam on the crest of a breaker appeared to almost move. I told myself it was a trick of the old, flickering gaslight-style fixtures in the lobby. I hoped I was right. Later, at the reception desk, I met Callan Fry, the night clerk. He was young, perhaps early 20s, thin and pale, with eyes that seemed too old for his face, the color of sea foam. He was meticulously polite, almost unnervingly so, speaking in a low, measured voice as he leafed through a leather-bound volume that looked like an ancient ship's log. He offered no insights, just courteous, empty phrases. My investigation began the next morning, sifting through the meager police reports on the disappearances. A frustrating collection of dead ends and shrugs. Each victim had simply ceased to be. No signs of struggle, no ransom notes, no forwarding addresses. Just an empty room and the sighing of the sea. I interviewed Marta Driggs again. She was guarded, her grief a wall, but she confirmed each victim had received an unsolicited, elegantly printed invitation to the Eve's Inn, promising a unique coastal retreat. The source of these invitations remained a mystery. That first night, the inn settled into an unnerving quiet. The wind howled outside, a mournful counterpoint to the rhythmic crash of waves. Well, after 1 a.m., I found myself drawn to the lobby, a reluctant moth to a disquieting flame. I remembered the first rule. I didn't look directly at the seascape painting. Instead, I let my gaze drift around its periphery as I pretended to examine a dusty display case of local shells. But even from the corner of my eye, I could sense it. A thrumming, almost subaudible hum emanated from the canvas. The air around it was palpably colder, and the painted waves, when I risked the briefest, sideways glance, seemed higher, more menacing than they had that afternoon. And with those figures, tiny, indistinct shapes in the painted spume, where before there had been only water, I dismissed it as fatigue, the power of suggestion. My exploration of the inn's creaking hallways led me to Juno Yates, a young woman who did the cleaning. She was a bundle of frayed nerves, her eyes wide and haunted. When I pressed her, gently, about the inn's history, she flinched. They don't like being talked about, she whispered, casting fearful glances down the shadowed corridor. The ones who don't leave. She eventually, reluctantly, showed me a sketchbook filled with childlike crayon drawings of a 3-masted schooner. In each drawing, the ship was slightly different. An extra sail here, a missing cannon port there, sometimes crewed by stick figures with vacant, staring eyes, sometimes entirely deserted. It's the Mercy's echo. She breathed. She comes for them. I saw her once. Just for a moment. Through the fog, her hand trembled as she sketched another version, this time with a dark figurehead that looked disturbingly like a screaming woman. The nights in my room were no less unsettling. The distinct, rhythmic creak of rope against wood, as if from a ship's rigging, seemed to emanate from the walls. The scent of brine and decaying seaweed would intensify without warning, even with the window sealed shut against the biting coastal wind. One morning, I found a small damp patch on the wooden floor beside my bed, shaped vaguely like a footprint, though no earthly shoe could have made it. It smelled faintly of the deep, cold ocean. I found Marcus' old police issue Zippo lighter in my bag, its familiar weight a small comfort. The flame, when I flicked it open, cast dancing, uneasy shadows. I resolved to get some silver coins. The small fishing village of Port Clyde, a few miles down the coast from the Eve's Inn, had a general store that, amongst the fishing lures and tourist trinkets, sold old silver dollars, polished to a dull sheen. I bought a handful, the weight of them in my pocket a tangible, if irrational, comfort. That night, I placed one on the crisp linen of my pillow, as per the second rule. I don't know if it was the coin or sheer exhaustion, but I slept. Uneasily, but I slept. Until a sudden, violent chill snapped me awake. The room was icy, the air thick with the smell of salt and something else, something rank and fishy. My window, which I was certain I'd latched, was ajar, the tattered lace curtain billowing inwards. And then I saw it. A hand resting on the windowsill. Long, pale fingers webbed with a thin, translucent membrane, glistening with moisture, the nails like chipped, yellowed ivory. It was pushing the window further open. My heart hammered against my ribs. I scrambled back, my hand fumbling for the mag light on the nightstand. The hand paused, then slowly, deliberately, began to withdraw. As it did, I heard a soft, wet sigh from outside, a sound of profound, guttural disappointment, followed by the faint, receding drip of water on the shingles below my window. I lay there, drenched in a cold sweat, until the first gray light of dawn. The silver dollar was still on my pillow, but it was tarnished now, a dark, ugly stain marring its surface, as if it had absorbed some vile miasma. I tried to get more out of old Captain Heron, or whatever unseen presence resided within the inn's ancient structure. His voice was never direct. Sometimes words would appear, as if written by an invisible finger, in the condensation on a mirror after a shower. The painter waits for the tide. Other times, a low, rumbling chuckle would echo from the empty fireplace when I mentioned the disappearances, followed by the distinct, spectral scent of cheap rum and stale pipe tobacco tarot. Once I found a single tarnished brass button, the kind used on old naval uniforms, resting on my case file for the Eve's Inn. Heron seemed more a trickster than a guide, his motives as murky as the waters he'd supposedly drowned in. He did, however, offer one cryptic clue, scrawled in the dust on a forgotten bookshelf. The Fry line is bound to the echo. Silver buys time, but only blood pays the true toll. The Fry line. Colin Fry. The name resonated. I'd done some digging into the local archives. The Mercy's Echo, the ship Juno Yates kept drawing, had indeed been captained by an Elias Fry in the late 1700s. He was the sole survivor of its sinking, a feat that had led to whispers of dark pacts made with whatever lurked in the abyssal depths. Colin, with his old books and his air of quiet detachment, was beginning to look less like an indifferent night clerk and more like a man burdened by a very old, very dark legacy. I noticed then when he was reaching for a ledger, the edge of a tattoo peeking from beneath his starched shirt cuff, a crudely rendered, old-fashioned ship's anchor. He quickly pulled his sleeve down when he saw me looking. The Eve's Inn was beginning to feel less like a place and more like a sentient trap. Time itself seemed to warp within its salt-stained walls. I'd glance at my watch, note the time, then look again, minutes later to find hours had passed. Or vice versa. Corridors I'd walked a dozen times would suddenly feel unfamiliar. A door that should have led to the dining room now opening onto a linen closet I'd never seen before. The numbers on the guest room door sometimes seemed to shift, to blur. My own room, number 7, occasionally felt like it was number 11 or 3. The dreams were the worst, vivid, terrifyingly real. I was on the deck of a storm-tossed schooner, the waves crashing over the rails, the wind screaming like a banshee, and Marcus was there, my old partner, his face pale, his eyes wide with a familiar terror, reaching out to me as a colossal, dark wave loomed, about to swallow us whole. I'd wake up gasping, the taste of salt water in my mouth, the phantom scent of wet wool clinging to me. The ocean painting in the lobby became my unwilling obsession. I adhered to the first rule, never looking at it directly after 1 a.m. But even during the day, its changes were becoming more pronounced, more personal. The sky in the painting would shift from stormy gray to an unnerving, sickly green. The waves grew higher, more menacing, and the figures, they were clearer now. Tiny, yes, but undeniably human, clinging to the wreckage of a ship that looked horrifyingly like the Mercy's Echo. One of them, a gaunt figure with wild, dark hair, looked disturbingly like Henderson, the detective who'd vanished before me. Another, with a familiar, haunted expression, was Marcus. His painted eyes seemed to follow me. I delved deeper into the history of Captain Elias Fry. He'd returned from the wreck of the Mercy's Echo, a changed man, they said. Rich, yes, from a salvaged cargo no one could quite account for, but also haunted, reclusive. He'd built the Eve's Inn on this desolate stretch of coast, but had rarely taken guests, preferring his own company and the company of the sea. He died screaming, according to local legend, during a storm much like the one that had sunk his ship, raving about the caller from the deep and the debt that must be paid. Colin Fry, when I tried to question him about his ancestor, became even more withdrawn, his polite mask slipping to reveal a flicker of something cold and resentful. Some histories are best left undisturbed, detective, he'd said, his voice flat. The sea doesn't give up its dead, Or it's bargains. One afternoon, Juno Yates, her face even paler than usual, pressed a small, folded piece of damp cloth into my hand. I found this, tucked under the pillow in room 7, after Mr. Henderson left, she stammered. I unfolded it. It was a fragment of what looked like a ship's pennant, cheap, modern souvenir fabric, but embroidered on it, in faded gold thread, was a stylized ship's anchor, identical to the tattoo on Callan Fry's wrist. And beneath it, almost invisible, were 3 tiny, meticulously stitched letters. M.E.H. Marcus Elias Henderson. The initials of the lost, woven into the fabric of the inn's curse. The fog rolled in that night with an unnatural, predatory swiftness. A thick, gray shroud, swallowing the eaves in, muffling the roar of the Atlantic to a distant, sorrowful moan. It wasn't just fog. It carried the biting chill of the abyssal depths and the unmistakable, suffocating stench of brine and ancient decay. The air in my room grew heavy, each breath an effort from somewhere outside. Faint and mournful, a sound began to drift through the swirling mist, the slow, rhythmic tolling of a ship's bell, a sound that resonated deep in my bones with a primal dread. Rule number 3. When you look outside and see a ghost ship anchored in the cove, that's your final voyage. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the encroaching silence. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away from the window, to barricade the door, to find some deep, dark corner and pray for morning. But Marcus' face, his eyes wide with that familiar terror from my dreams, swam before my vision. Henderson's neatly written notes devolving into madness. The dark handprint on the linen. The debt I owed them, the one I owed myself, was a stronger pull. I forced myself to the salt-caked window, wiping away the condensation with a trembling hand. I peered out into the swirling, phosphorescent gray, and there she was, anchored in the small, treacherous cove directly below the inn, her skeletal masts piercing the fog like a forgotten god's decaying fingers. Was the Mercy's echo. She wasn't a memory, not a dream. She was terrifyingly, supernaturally real. Her timbers were black with age and rot, festooned with grotesque, undulating swathes of seaweed and barnacles that pulsed with a faint, sickly green luminescence. Her tattered sails, like burial shrouds, billowed softly in a wind I couldn't feel. Eerie, cold lights, like corpse candles, flickered from her empty portholes, and on her foredeck, shrouded in mist but undeniably present, were figures, pale, indistinct, their movements slow and jerky, like puppets on decaying strings. I saw Henderson, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. I saw the other faces from the inn's grim ledger of the lost, and I saw Marcus. He was looking directly at me, his hand outstretched, a silent, sorrowful invitation. His lips moved, forming my name, though no sound reached me through the glass, only the tolling of that damned bell. A wave of profound narcotic weariness washed over me. The urge to open the window, to step out onto the narrow, treacherous cliff path, to join them on that final silent voyage, was almost irresistible. It wasn't fear. It was a strange, seductive longing for an end to struggle, for the cold, quiet embrace of the deep. They're beautiful, aren't they, detective? In their own way. Callan Fry's voice, quiet and eerily calm, came from the doorway. I hadn't heard him enter. He stood there, no longer the diffident night clerk, but something older, colder. His eyes reflected the ghostly light from the phantom ship, and the small anchor tattoo on his wrist seemed to almost glow. He held a small, tarnished silver bell in one hand, identical to the one whose tolling echoed from the cove. "This is your doing, Fry," I said, my voice a hoarse rasp, tearing my gaze away from the spectral invitation outside. "That ship, the disappearances, the painting." He smiled, a thin, chilling curve of his lips. "My doing? No, detective. Mine is merely to facilitate, to honor the ancient covenant. My ancestor, Captain Elias Fry, he made a bargain in the heart of a storm with power from the deep, Velvactor, the tidebound, the caller from the abyssal plane. Life in exchange for tribute. He gestured towards the window, towards the Mercy's echo. The painting in the lobby is its window to this world. The ship is its vessel for collection. And I, as the last of the Fry line, am its humble servant, its harbor master, if you will. You've been luring them here, I accused, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. The invitations. You've been feeding this thing. Innocent people. Innocent. Fry's smile widened, but it held no warmth. Only a profound, ancient weariness. The sea makes no such distinctions, detective. It only claims what is due. Velvactor granted Elias passage through the gates of death. In return, it requires passage for others into its domain. 13 souls, for each generation of the Fry bloodline to renew the pact, to keep the tidebound appeased, and to grant a certain longevity to those who serve faithfully. He looked out at the phantom ship, his expression almost wistful. Imagine, detective, an eternity with the sea. No more pain, no more struggle. Just the cold, endless peace of the deep. My ancestor awaits me there, and soon I will join him once my debt is paid in full. And Marcus, Henderson, they were just installments on your family's demonic mortgage. The rage in my voice was a raw, burning thing. They saw the ship, detective. God, just as you are seeing it now. They understood the invitation. Fry's gaze hardened. I even tried to break the line, you know. Years ago. To end this, a length of rope, a sturdy beam in the attic. He touched his neck absently. Velvactor does not permit such dereliction of beauty. It pulled me back, reminded me of my obligations. The toll must be paid. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. You are number 12, detective, so very close to completing the choir. Then perhaps I too can finally rest. He raised the small silver bell in his hand, preparing to ring it. A sound that I knew with chilling certainty would be the final summons. The figures on the Mercy's echo seemed to lean forward, their empty eyes fixed on me with a hungry anticipation. From the painting in the lobby downstairs, I could almost hear a low, resonant hum, like the abyssal breathing of some colossal, submerged intelligence. Velvactor was stirring, its influence coiling around the inn, around me, tightening its spectral grip. The final voyage was at hand, and the tide was rapidly, inexorably coming in. Colin Fry's confession, a tale of generational damnation and desperate servitude, hung in the frigid, salt-laced air. The tolling of the Mercy's echo's bell grew louder, more insistent, each chime a nail hammered into the coffin of my hope. The figures on deck, Marcus among them, beckoned with a cold, irresistible allure. Velvactor's hunger was a palpable presence, a suffocating weight pressing in from the mist-shrouded cove. Fry raised the small silver bell, his eyes alight with a mixture of grim duty and a terrifying, weary anticipation. It is time, detective. The tide waits for no man. My mind raced. The rules, they weren't just warnings. They were parameters, vulnerabilities. Don't look at the ocean painting. After 1 a.m. Silver coin. Wards off the drowned. Ghost ship. Final voyage. But what if the rules could be bent, reflected? Old Captain Heron's cryptic whispers echoed in my memory. The painter waits for the tide. Silver buys time, but only blood pays the true toll. And then another fragment, one I dismissed as rambling, surfaced. Mirrors hold no sway for the deep ones, but an image of an image that confounds the call. An image of an image, the painting. It was Velvactor's window. Fry had said so, but the rules specified looking at it. What if the entity, or its power through the painting, couldn't distinguish a direct gaze from a reflected one, especially when its psychic energies were focused elsewhere, like on the manifested ghost ship? The tide may wait for no man, Fry, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, considering the abyss yawning before me. But sometimes, a man can redirect the current, It was well after 1 a.m. The fog outside was so thick it seemed to press against the window panes. The ghost ship, the Mercy's Echo, was a solid, undeniable presence in the cove, its spectral lights casting an unholy glow. This was the peak of Velvactor's power, the moment of summoning. I backed away from the window, towards the antique, full-length cheval glass mirror that stood in the corner of my room, its silvering tarnished with age. It had been covered with a dust sheet, but I'd pulled it off during my initial search of the room. Fry watched me, a flicker of confusion in his cold eyes. "What are you doing, detective? You cannot escape the summons. No one ever has." "I'm not trying to escape it, Fry," I said, positioning the heavy mirror so it directly faced the window, and by extension, the anchored Mercy's Echo. "I'm offering it a different perspective." Then I turned my back to the window, to the spectral ship and its beckoning crew. Instead, I faced the mirror, and in its dim, wavering reflection, I saw the ghost ship, the mist, the yearning figures on its deck. I was looking at an image of an image, and I stared directly into the reflected heart of the storm-racked sea, within the massive oil painting in the lobby downstairs, now visible in a smaller secondary mirror, angled just so on my dresser. A trick of the inn's strange, shifting geometry that I'd only just consciously registered. It was a distorted multiple reflection, but undeniably, I was looking at the painting after 1 a.m., while the ghost ship was anchored. I was fulfilling, yet subverting, two rules simultaneously. A low, guttural moan of confusion, of frustration, echoed not from the cove, but from the very walls of the inn. The tolling of the ship's bell faltered, becoming discordant. The air in the room vibrated, the pressure intensifying to an almost unbearable degree. In the reflection, the figures on the Mercy's Echo paused, their beckoning gestures frozen, their empty eyes seeming to flicker with a primal uncertainty. Fry gasped, his hand clutching his chest, his face contorting. "No. What sorcery is this?" The call. It's twisting." The painting in the lobby. I could feel its power, even through the layers of reflection, seemed to fight back, to try and assert its direct claim. But the manifested ship, the primary conduit for the current summons, was now receiving a corrupted signal, a feedback loop of its own reflected power. Velvactor, it seemed, was not accustomed to such paradoxes. The silver bell in Fry's hand began to glow with an intense, sickly green light, the same light that emanated from the ghost ship and the core of the painting. He cried out, dropping the bell as it suddenly became too hot to hold. It clattered to the floor, the tolling ceasing abruptly. And then the screaming started, not from me, but from Colin Fry. He clawed at his own skin, his eyes wide with a terror that dwarfed anything I had yet witnessed. "It's wrong." The reflection. It's calling. Me, the bloodline, the anchor in the cheval glass. The reflection of the Mercy's Echo began to waver, to distort violently. But it wasn't fading. Instead, the image of Colin Fry, standing beside me in the room, began to shimmer, to become translucent, and the reflection of the ship seemed to surge towards his reflected image, its spectral timbers passing through the reflection of the room, as if the mirror had become a gateway, not for me, but for him. His own damning heritage, his unbreakable bond to the Mercy's Echo, and its original sin, was now his undoing. The tide redirected was claiming its own. Colin Fry's screams intensified, becoming a high-pitched, inhuman shriek as his reflection in the cheval glass was violently pulled, stretched, and then seemingly absorbed into the spectral image of the Mercy's Echo. His physical body in the room convulsed, then went limp, slumping to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut, his eyes wide, vacant, and clouded with the same milky film I'd seen in the eyes of the drowned. The stench of brine and decay filled the room, overpowering, then just as quickly began to recede. In the mirror, the ghost ship, the Mercy's Echo, with its newly acquired, shimmering passenger, began to slowly, majestically fade. The figures on its deck, including the spectral image of Marcus, turned their gaze from me, their expressions no longer beckoning, but Peaceful? Resigned? It was hard to tell. As the ship dissolved into the swirling fog, the tolling of its bell sounded one last time. A faint, melancholic note that seemed to carry a hint of release. Then, silence. A profound, echoing silence, broken only by the natural sound of the wind and the distant, rhythmic crash of the real Atlantic waves. The oppressive atmosphere in the room lifted as if a great weight had been removed. The unnatural chill dissipated. I looked at the painting in the lobby via my dresser mirror. It was still a turbulent, brooding seascape. But the inner light, the sense of malevolent sentience, was gone. It was just a painting again, a dark, unsettling work of art, but nothing more. Marta Driggs found me at dawn, sitting by the window, staring out at a calm gray sea. Fry's body lay on the floor. I told her a version of the truth, omitting the more unbelievable reflections. I said Fry had been responsible, that he'd succumbed to some family madness, that his actions had triggered a series of freak occurrences, culminating in his death. She listened, her face unreadable, then nodded slowly. The sea, it always collects its debts, Mr. Hart, one way or another. She looked at Fry's still form. Perhaps Elias can finally rest now. And my Michael and little Sarah. The Eve's Inn was closed shortly thereafter. Marta sold it to a developer who, locals whispered, planned to tear it down and build luxury condos. Though the project kept getting mysteriously delayed. The painting was taken down, crated up, and sent to a distant, obscure museum archive. Labeled simply 19th century seascape, artist unknown. I returned to Portland, to my quiet, solitary life. The case was officially closed. Fry, a disturbed individual responsible for the earlier disappearances through unknown means, who then took his own life. No mention of ghost ships, ancient sea demons, or cursed paintings. The world preferred its horrors neat and explicable. But the sea, as I learned, has a long memory. About a year later, I was walking along a windswept beach in a different state, hundreds of miles from Maine. The tide was out, revealing a stretch of sand littered with driftwood and shells. My eye caught something half buried in the wet sand. It was a small, tarnished silver bell, identical to the one Colin Fry had held. As I picked it up, a faint, cold mist began to roll in from the ocean, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, I thought I heard the distant, mournful tolling of a ship's bell. I looked out at the horizon, at the endless gray expanse. Velvactor was still out there, in the deep, dark places. Its window to our world might be closed, its harbor master claimed, but the tide always eventually returns, and it always seeks a new shore, new bargains, new echoes in the deep. The ocean's canvas was vast, and there were always more stories waiting to be painted in shades of brine and blood. My own voyage, I suspected, was merely in a temporary, uneasy calm between storms. The Eve's Inn held its secrets close, guarded by tides from another world. Rowan Hart learned that some investigations lead to places that defy explanation. The rules were a desperate guide through a terrifying performance staged by the sea itself. The final voyage was taken, but the ocean remembers. Seriously, if you didn't stay until the very end, you missed the ultimate twist, the final chilling echo that reveals the true, ongoing nature of the Eve's Inn's curse. The last few moments will make you look differently at the waves. What do you think Velvactor truly is? What was Captain Elias Fry's original bargain? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you made it through the night at the Eve's Inn, if the tide hasn't claimed you, then you're already a part of our story. Subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules, because some debts are paid in souls, and the sea is always hungry.